The Gulag Archipelago, I will be creating a whole series of shorts summarizing and highlighting important points, a short for each chapter of this book. This is a very hefty one. This is one of the biggest books in human history, and it's worth the read. This book gives a full account of what life is like in a Soviet-Russian prison in the 1950s and 40s. The preface makes mention of a specific event when a group of Russian prisoners uncovered a frozen prehistoric salamander that was trapped in the ice for thousands of years. And the first thing they did was hastily thaw the ice, cook it, and eat it voraciously. And Solzhenitsyn says that only someone who was a part of that life would have understood what it was to voraciously eat a prehistoric animal trapped in ice. Another important point that comes up in the preface, he mentions that this book is his obligation to the dead. He feels an obligation to tell the world about what went on. That concept will come up again later in this book. Gulag Archipelago, Book 1, Chapter 1, The Arrest. In this one, Solzhenitsyn talks about his own arrest and various different methods for arresting people that the Soviet secret police, the Blue Caps, used. A common theme is that most of the people arrested were completely innocent. They had done nothing wrong. Solzhenitsyn describes what he calls the lamb-like bleat of the phrase, "Me, what for?" whenever the police tell somebody that they're under arrest. In fact, the people getting arrested are referred to as rabbits. Gives one example of the police sending a notification in the mail to thousands of people at a time. Come to this location on this date, you are under arrest, and the people actually come. Mostly because the people outside the prison system, in freedom as he calls it, have no way of knowing the amount of injustice that goes on within the prison system. They still have faith in the government and the courts. They still believe that their unfair case will be set right. The Soviet Union often arrested people in the middle of the night. This was for privacy, among other reasons. They did not like being observed. They did not like when people made a big scene when they were being arrested. They liked being able to take someone completely unprepared, literally waking them up before they even have a chance to get dressed. He reflects, what if the secret police had been afraid for their lives every time they go out and try to arrest someone? Quote, "We didn't love freedom enough. Even more, we had no awareness of the real situation. We spent ourselves in one unrestrained outburst in 1917, and then we hurried to submit. We submitted with pleasure," end quote. Quote, "We purely and simply deserve everything that happened afterward," end quote. Solzhenitsyn blames the people themselves for allowing the government to abuse them as much as the Soviet Union did. He concludes they should have done more to resist all the abuses by the government. Solzhenitsyn reflected on why the people of Moscow were so passive in the face of so many innocent people getting arrested. He describes one time where they tried to arrest a woman in the middle of broad daylight. She grabbed onto a lamppost and started screaming, so they let her go for now. But later on, instead of taking a train out of town and disappearing, she went back to her home and tried to stay the night there. They came back that night and arrested her then in privacy. Quote, "If many such outcries had been heard all over the city over the course of a day, would not our fellow citizens have begun to bristle, and would arrest perhaps no longer have been so easy," end quote. The people simply did not know what kind of atrocities were going on, and furthermore they still trusted the government. Quote, "You still believe that the organs are humanly logical institutions. They will set things straight and let you out. Why then should you run away? And how can you resist right then? After all, you'll only make your own situation worse," end quote. Solzhenitsyn talks about his own arrest. He was an officer in the army during World War II. He had been writing letters to one of his friends that he grew up with, who happened to be across the border in a different country. That's all the evidence they needed. He was accused of treason. They arrested him right in the middle of a war zone. Furthermore, the people who made the arrest weren't familiar with the city streets of Moscow. Solzhenitsyn himself had to help them navigate their way to the prison. He talks about why he didn't cry out for help at any point while they were transporting him there. Quote, "Every man has perhaps a dozen reasons why he should not sacrifice himself for the good of the whole. As for me, I kept silent for one further reason, because those Muscovites thronging the steps of the escalator were too few for me. Too few. Here my cry would only be heard by 200 or thrice 200, but what about the 200 million? Vaguely, uncertainly, I had a vision that someday I would cry out to the 200 million, unquote. Chapter 2 starts out describing the history of the Soviet prison system, and it emphasizes that the wave of arrests in 1937 and 38, which was well known at the time, was not the only one, nor by far the biggest one. What set that one apart was that the people in that wave of arrests were educated and more likely to write about it. In pretty much every year of Soviet history, there were innumerable arrests. People who Vladimir Lenin described in one essay as being insects. So, who got arrested? Well, protesters, of course, also Christians, pacifists. Writers and scholars, they did a lot of this under the pretense of economic sabotage. They were accused of working slowly at their jobs because they wanted to undermine the economic output of the Soviet Union. This was anti-revolutionary, thought crime, prison. Quote, men of religion were an inevitable part of every annual catch, and their silver locks gleamed in every cell and in every prison transport en route to the Solovetsky Islands. End quote. This is describing the arrests of Christians during the time of Vladimir Lenin in the Soviet Union. 1922 was a big year for Christians in USSR. They did a church revolution, they replaced the leadership of the church, and they criminalized people who did not follow their state church. Quote, true, they were supposedly being arrested and tried not for their actual faith, but for openly declaring their conviction and for bringing up their children in the same spirit. As Tanya Kodkovich wrote, you can pray freely, but just so God can hear. She received a 10-year sentence for those verses. A person who was convinced he possessed spiritual truth was required to conceal it from his own children. End quote. And in fact, it was written into the criminal code that teaching religion to children was illegal. And who else did the Soviets arrest during the 20s and 30s? Well, believe it or not, they had a big problem with other left-wing parties who were just a different flavor of socialist from the Bolsheviks. Solzhenitsyn describes they kept party membership lists for decades and decades, long after people have resigned from their former party and joined the Bolsheviks. Might be tomorrow, might be next year, might be 10 years down the road. They will call you into an office, ask you, were you a member of this organization during this time and this time? And then you will be arrested. And they purposely played the long game with this because they did not want to arouse suspicion. Quote, this was a grandiose, silent game of solitaire whose rules were totally incomprehensible to its contemporaries, and whose outlines we can appreciate only now. Someone's far-seeing mind, someone's neat hands planned it all without letting one wasted minute go by. End quote. Solzhenitsyn talks about the so-called gold wave of arrest, and this was pretty simple. The Soviet government wanted gold. So what they did, they made lists of people who they thought were likely to have gold. These people included former business owners, watchmakers, dentists, jewelers. Also, it's the Soviet Union, so if someone doesn't like you, they could simply denounce you, say, hey, I think this person has a secret gold stash buried in the backyard somewhere. That would be enough, and what they would do is arrest you. They would say, hand over your gold, or else. They might torture you, they might arrest family members. And if you didn't have any gold, according to Solzhenitsyn, less than half of the people arrested actually had gold. You simply had to take what was coming to you, sadly enough. He tells us one of the preferred torture methods here was to feed people only salty food and no water for days on end. And then the interrogators would say, hey, if you want water, you need to hand over your gold. The term kulak in the Soviet Union had a stigma of being miserly rural traders. The term, though, gradually expanded to cover more and more people. It covered anyone who had employees. It eventually started covering any strong peasants and farmers. And hey, funny how this next part works, it started covering people who chose not to work on the collective farms. Eventually, even the people who did work on the farms, if they happened to be too well-liked in the community meetings, the term podkulaknik came up. That means ally of the kulaks. Many thousands of arrests. Quote, it was the forced resettlement of a whole people, an ethnic catastrophe, yet so cleanly were the channels of the GPU organized that they would have noticed nothing in the cities had they not been stricken with a strange 3-year famine. End quote. And then after they have everyone on the collective farms, they blame any failure on economic wrecking, and they find the people responsible and arrest them. Notable among these children who go out to the fields in the middle of the night to pick extra food for their families. As for the actual Soviet criminal code itself, this was Article 58. The Soviets used word salad to explain how people convicted under 58 were not actually political prisoners. It was a crime against the state. Counter-revolutionary action, they called it, akin to treason. Many articles that were interpreted very broadly so that pretty much anyone could be convicted under this. They had flexible interpretations as to what constituted intent, and under Soviet law, intent was the same thing as actually committing the crime. Notably, even Russian prisoners of war returning home from German prisoner camps were then put into Russian gulags under Article 58 because they had dared to allow themselves to be captured by the enemy. And to top it off, Section 11 of Article 58 was able to compound any of the other sections in 58. Basically, Section 11 applied if you did it as part of a group, and a group could be as few as 2 people. Would you like to hear how Soviet Russia crippled its own infrastructure? Well, it all has to do with this witch hunt for economic wreckers. Quote, in the metallurgy, defense, machinery, shipbuilding, chemical mining, gold and platinum industries, irrigation, everywhere there were pus-filled boils of wrecking, end quote. Quote, the sentinel of the revolution narrowed its eyes with even greater vigilance, and wherever it directed its narrowed gaze, it inevitably discovered a nest of wreckers, end quote. These arrests for economic wrecking started targeting engineers in the cities, particularly those who were employed in their fields before the revolution. It got to the point where they risked draining off too many professional industrial people from their economy. Electrical engineers, bridge architects, sewage architects, other utilities workers. Notably, they even arrested experts in military logistics, and I wonder what's going to happen when 1941 rolls around. After World War II, Stalin's government arrested a lot of the people who had lived for any amount of time in German-occupied territory. Quote, those who were in Europe got the stiffest punishments of all, even though they went there as conscripted German slaves. That was because they had seen something of European life and could talk about it. Not everyone, after all, could repeat that things in Europe were hopelessly bad and that it was absolutely impossible to live there. That also was the reason why they sentenced the majority of war prisoners, not only because they had allowed themselves to be captured, particularly those POWs who had seen a little more of the West than a German death camp, end quote. Notably, though, some of Stalin's World War II arrests were actual enemies of the state. These included people from Hitler's Vlasov Battalion, also the Nazi, Muslim, and Cossack fighting groups. One particular example Solzhenitsyn talks about was a group of Russian soldiers who had lived in Sweden for some amount of time. This is the Kadenko group. They came back to Russia. They got arrested for praising life in a capitalist nation. Now, this was not the end of the story. Western newspapers found out that they were arrested and started publishing this in the press. So what did Soviet Russia do? Well, let's find some people from this group who are cooperative. Let's take them out of the camps, feed them, clean them up, let them grow their hair. They held a press conference where these people talked to the Western journalists, told them how big of a lie it was, what they printed in their newspapers. And after that press conference, those Kadenko men were sent right back to prison. Solzhenitsyn talks about the decrees that the Stalinist government would make. This was special legislation to address a special type of crime for a particular time period. So the Stalinist government would make a decree about revealing state secrets, for example, and then all of a sudden, all these people got caught leaking state secrets, and a whole new wave of people went into the prison system. Other examples would be illegal brewing of alcohol, rape, theft. Whether or not these people were actually guilty was a whole nother thing. Also talks about a wave of repeaters. These were people arrested in 1937, they got a 10-year sentence, they finished the sentence, they went back home, but not for long, they were arrested again. They were given a whole new sentence and sent back to prison. There were also, he says, 2 million Russian expats who were forcibly relocated back to Russia by the Western governments. And you guessed it, they lived in the West, they had too many good stories to tell. Gulag. Chapter 3, Solzhenitsyn writes about Soviet interrogations. Now, the goal of the interrogation, the interrogator's job was to get a signed confession from the prisoner. And almost always this stuff was entirely made up. Completely fabricated cases, blatantly false stories. Quote, the time allotted to an investigation was not used to unravel the crime, but, in 95 cases out of 100, to exhaust, wear down, weaken, and render helpless the defendant, so that he would want it to end at any cost, end quote. So it becomes a battle of wills. How long can this prisoner possibly hold on before he signs something that is blatantly false? Quote, once it was established that charges had to be brought at any cost and despite everything, threats, violence, and tortures became inevitable. And the more fantastic the charges were, the more ferocious the interrogation had to be in order to force the required confession, end quote. Quote, there never were any spiritual or moral barriers which could have held the organs back from torture, end quote. Solzhenitsyn describes how on paper the interrogators weren't allowed to use torture, but of course they did it anyway. And, quote, the types of torture used were not regulated, and every kind of ingenuity was permitted, no matter what, end quote. Ingenuity really was the operative word there. They got creative with those tortures. He also describes a period between 1937 and 1938, where outside of that time the interrogators would have needed written permission to use physical violence on the prisoners. However, during those 2 years, there was an exception to that, where the law was more permissive towards interrogators doing beatings and other physical tortures. So what kinds of tortures did they use? Well, there's always the classic keeping a revolver pistol on the table while you're talking to the prisoner. They used extremes of temperature, both hot and cold. Quote, "The heat in such a cell was turned up until your blood began to ooze through your pores." When they saw this happening through the peephole, they would put the prisoner on a stretcher and take him off to sign his confession, end quote. This chapter also tells the story of someone who was kept in a room where they had to stand in a pool of icy water up to their ankles for an extended period of time. Stand there and worry about frostbite, amputating toes, hypothermia, you know. He described a cell that only had enough room for one person to stand in, and in order to sleep, it was required that the guards from the outside put a pole inside that cell that the prisoner could grab onto for only 4 hours of night of sleep. They also used beatings and cigarette burns, of course. They also had people stand or sit on a stool sometimes in a hallway for hours, sometimes days at a time, without leaning on anything or sleep. Quote, "Psychological methods of torture. These methods have an enormous and even annihilating impact on rabbits who have never been prepared for prison suffering. And it isn't easy even for a person who has strong convictions," end quote. They loved doing things at nighttime, both because it's disorienting and because it interferes with the prisoner's sleep. They would do the good cop, bad cop thing, except have only one person doing it, switching the tone up. Being nice to you 1 minute and then threatening to bash your skull in with a paperweight the next. They would, of course, try persuasion, tell you you're going to prison either way, it's better to just sign the confession now, save yourself some trouble. They would threaten you with a worse prison than you were currently in. Something else they would do is produce a fake document, which basically says, "I understand, I've read and reviewed this paper. I've been informed that giving false testimony could get me 5 years of hard labor," even though in reality the penalty for that was not as harsh. Soviet interrogators were big fans of using your family against you. They would often threaten people to arrest or harm family members if they didn't confess. They would produce forged letters, denunciation letters, that had the signatures of a family member or a friend forged on the letter. They would find someone with similar handwriting to your wife and make a whole dramatic breakup letter. They might even tell you, "Hey, we've already arrested your wife. Hey, listen, do you hear that? Do you hear that screaming in the other room? That's her." Now, it might not actually be your wife, it could be just some random woman. Solzhenitsyn writes that it's hard to tell one scream apart from another. In fact, though, something the interrogators were not above doing was actually calling your wife in for something minor, but then having her walk down the hallway at the right time that you could see her, but she could not see you. So you know that she was in the prison, they could do what they want with her. Quote, "The reality is that the interrogators like some diversion in their monotonous work. And so they vie in thinking up new ideas," end quote. Some of the new and creative ideas for torture methods that Soviet interrogators came up with for prisoners included putting them in a white room with bright light and keeping them there for hours or days, such that the light sometimes even burned through their eyelids. There was a description of a person who, hours at a time, got called out of his cell, "Hey, we want to talk to you," gets all the way to the door of the interrogation room and then says, "Hey, we don't need you anymore, go back to your cell." Back and forth, hours and hours. The process is the punishment. Sometimes they would have 2 people with megaphones on each side of a person, hold the megaphones right up to the person's ears and yell, "Confess!" Blow the person's eardrums out, and of course sometimes they just tied people up and tickled them. Solzhenitsyn writes that the effects of sleep deprivation were completely underestimated by medieval torture minds, but the Soviets used it well. They would keep one person under interrogation for over 24 hours, sometimes multiple days at a time, just have the interrogators working in shifts. They would put people in stress positions while keeping them awake. They could be hogtied or some other position that put stress on their back. They could have them sitting on their knees for over 24 hours at a time. Solzhenitsyn tells a story of one person who was over 24 hours kneeling down in the interrogator's office. And of course the interrogators would come and go in shifts, go home, eat, sleep, come back, the prisoner is still awake. Over 24 hours with this one guy, and finally they peed on his face while he was kneeling down, and that was his breaking point when he signed the confession. A torture method you may be surprised about is a box with either lice or mosquitoes or bed bugs Put the prisoner in there for hours at a time until they give up even trying to crush all the bugs. Just sit there and let the bugs drink their blood. Fingernails, of course, were not safe. Genitalia, of course, was not safe. Shins and finger bones were not safe. Breaking of the backbone was sometimes used. Solzhenitsyn describes the effect of hitting the sciatic nerve, especially when the body is skinny and famished. Prisoners would be pulled around by their hair or their beard. And, of course, some of the prisoners there would encourage their fellow prisoners to just sign the confession and get it over with. Not only that, but it was a fear tactic of seeing your fellow prisoners with the marks on their bodies and knowing what was coming to you. Prison overcrowding was another method of torture for the prisoners. Mention is made of a cell that's meant for one person in solitary confinement being packed with either 15 or 18 prisoners at a time. There was mention of a cell that was meant for 24 people being packed with 180 or more people. And, of course, with so many people, the guards didn't want to bother too often letting them go out to the toilet. So, once a day, they took the rooms out to go to the toilet. And of course, quote, as always, Stalin did not pronounce that final word, and his subordinates had to guess what he wanted. Thus, like a jackal, he left himself an escape hole, so he could, if he wanted. After all, for the first time in human history, the calculated torture of millions was being undertaken, and even with all his strength and power, Stalin could not be absolutely sure of success. End quote. Plausible deniability at the top. Often Soviet prisoners in their interrogation would feel lucky if they could get out of it taking all the penalty on themselves, and avoid getting anyone else in trouble, especially their family. Quote, after 11 years during rehabilitation proceedings, they let me read those dispositions, and I was gripped by a spiritual nausea. What was there to be proud of? End quote. With all the tortures that go on in those prisons, both physical and psychological, Solzhenitsyn begs the reader not to judge prisoners too harshly who quickly sign a confession and declare themselves guilty of something that they did not do. He goes on to muse about the concept of a confession being a chief proof of guilt, contrasting that with the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. That is the one that gives U.S. citizens the right to not incriminate themselves during a trial. A large part of this interrogation process relied on the prisoners not understanding the criminal code. Because after all, in Soviet Russia, if you ask for something like the criminal code, that will raise eyebrows. Why do you want to know that, huh? Are you planning on committing a crime? But it turns out, in fact, there was the criminal code as well as the criminal procedural code, which were two separate things. Solzhenitsyn only years later was able to get and read a copy of that procedural code. As he found out when he read it, the interrogator, at least on paper, is not allowed to compel or threaten the prisoners. Ha 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 ha! Who knew? The interrogators might have, but the prisoners did not, and that's what mattered. But even if they did, the prosecutors did not care. They let the interrogators do what they want because they needed to fill those quotas and get bodies to work in the mines. Quote, we are not going to sweat to prove the prisoner's guilt to him. Let him prove to us that he did not have hostile intent. Unquote. Solzhenitsyn writes, quote, it turned out that during the interrogation I had the right to make written complaints against anything improper in its conduct, and the interrogator was obliged to staple these complaints to my record during the interrogation, not after, end quote. Quote, the prosecutor was required by law to ask what complaints I had about the conduct of the interrogation and whether coercion had been used or any violations of my legal rights had occurred. But it had been a long time since prosecutors asked such questions, and what if they had? After all, the existence of that entire ministry building was based on violations of legal rights, end quote. Solzhenitsyn describes at the very end of his interrogation he found this out, and he brings it up to the prosecutor and the interrogator, and at that point, what do they say? You conducted the interrogation improperly? Okay, yeah, let's do it again. And at that point, Solzhenitsyn is willing to just sign the paper and get out of there. As for his own sentence, Solzhenitsyn describes that he was extremely stupid and extremely careless, exchanging so many wartime letters when he knew there were censors going through the mail, explicitly talking with people about politics. They didn't even need to make anything up to pin on him. Furthermore, do you remember Section 11, an organization, or a group of two people in this case? That was one of the things he protested when the prosecutor was reviewing his case after the interrogation. The prosecutor told him that the Section 11 would not add years onto his sentence, although it was a compounding charge. He only found out later on that because of that Section 11, he got sent to a hard labor camp, and also because of that Section 11, after his prison term was up, he had to also go through a term of exile. Solzhenitsyn rounds out the chapter by talking about how his war diary got burned. All his papers and letters got burned. They were just a few among many, many, many things that got burned in the Butyrka furnace. He also briefly describes the soot that constantly fell in the Butyrka during this time. Quote, "Oh, how many ideas and works perished in that building, a whole lost culture. Oh, soot from the Lubyanka chimneys. And the most hurtful thing of all was that our descendants would consider our generation more stupid, less gifted, less vocal than in actual fact it was." End quote. He mourns the lost literature that might have been. A common theme in this book that you'll see hit on more later is the ways that prison changes people. And we get a tiny, tiny snapshot of this in this chapter early on. Quote, "Yulia Rumyantseva was confined in the internal prison of a Nazi camp, while they tried to find out from her the whereabouts of her husband who had escaped from that same camp. She knew, but she refused to tell. For a reader who is not in the know, this is a model of heroism. For a reader with a bitter Gulag past, this is a model of inefficient interrogation. Yulia did not die under torture, and she was not driven insane. A month later, she was simply released, still very much alive and kicking." End quote. A testament to the creativity of the Soviet interrogators. The Gulag Archipelago, Chapter 4 has to deal with the Blue Caps. That is the nickname for members of the secret police, the blue cap being, of course, a blue hat that they wore as part of their uniform. Quote, "The Blue Caps understood the workings of the meat grinder and love it." End quote. This chapter goes deeper than you would expect, exploring the mentality of what it would take to work as an interrogator, a member of the secret police, an executioner, for a totalitarian regime. Quote, "They understood that the cases were fabricated, and yet they kept working year after year. Why?" End quote. He lists a few reasons. First, a mentality that the boss is always right. They're unthinking, they love conformity, they love comfort, and they love the rewards that are offered to them. Quote, "Their branch of service requires only that they carry out orders exactly and that they be impervious to suffering. That is what they do and what they are." End quote. Solzhenitsyn goes into describing the incentives for interrogators to break a prisoner faster, sooner, and also the fear that they would lose their job if they didn't do it well enough or fast enough. He talks about the excitement and creativity they took in coming up with new and exciting ways to torture. Also talks about Stalin's paranoia that fueled the drive to find more guilty verdicts. Stalin would not, could not, refuse to believe that in any given province, any given area, he could be devoid of political enemies. They brought ego into the interrogation room too. Quote, "By refusing to confess, they menaced the interrogator's personal standing." End quote. Quote, "If you want it to be war, then war it will be." End quote. Quote, "I love strong opponents. It's so good to break their backs." End quote. Along with that, of course, there is also their blind obedience to state orthodoxy. Their willingness to just follow orders, just go along with it. Their willingness to be good to the organs of the state. Quote, "Interrogation and trial are merely judicial collaboration. They cannot alter your fate, which was previously decided. If it is necessary to shoot you, you will be shot even if you are altogether innocent. If it is necessary to acquit you, then no matter how guilty you are, you will be cleared and acquitted." End quote. In exploring the mentality of the Blue Caps, Solzhenitsyn quotes Tolstoy, quote, "Ivan Ilyich had accepted an official position which gave him authority to destroy anyone he wanted to. All, without exception, were in his hands, and anyone, even the most important, could be brought before him as an accused." End quote. More than getting the Christian message that I got from Ivan Ilyich out of that story, Solzhenitsyn highlighted the attraction to judicial power that Ivan Ilyich had. Says, though, that Ivan Ilyich had self-restraint in contrast to the Blue Caps. Ivan took it as a personal responsibility to wield that power well. Not so with the Blue Caps, quote, "From the moment you donned that heavenly blue service cap, you stood higher than the publicly acknowledged power. No one dares check up on what you do, but no one is exempt from your checking up on them." End quote. Solzhenitsyn talks about the corruption that comes along with that kind of authority. talks about the pettiness, how they would arrest people or threaten to arrest people for the most insignificant things, talks about sexual harassment of prisoners in the interrogation rooms, of course. Tells one particular story, talks about a blue cap who threatened and coerced someone else's wife into sleeping with him. Of course, threatened to arrest her father and her husband. I don't know exactly what acts were committed, but it left her in a hospital bed. And then when the husband confronted the guy, by the end of the confrontation he was cowed into submission by threats of arrest. Quote, anything you saw was yours, any apartment you looked at was yours, any woman was yours, any enemy was struck from your path, end quote. They used this power to sleep with people, they used it to steal, to amass wealth. They had the ability to omit an item from the list of belongings confiscated from a prisoner and just keep it themselves. Or just steal from their house. The Blue Caps had very few rules and restrictions, but one of them was an unspoken and absolute rule: do not go against the organs. That included doing wrong to your fellow Blue Caps. And you'd be surprised, many of them surprisingly did not catch on to this until it was too late. Excerpt from one Blue Cap story he tells, quote, he would have gotten away with this too, but he had violated another important rule. Like Khrushchev, he went against his own kind. Khrushchev deceived the organs. This colonel did perhaps even worse. He laid bets on which wives he could seduce, and not just ordinary wives, but the wives of his colleagues in the security police, and he was not forgiven. He was sentenced under Article 58 and was serving out his time fuming at their having dared to arrest him. He had no doubt that they would change their minds, and perhaps they did, end quote. Quote, that dread fate to be thrown in prison themselves was not such a rarity for the Blue Caps. There was no genuine insurance against it. End quote. Solzhenitsyn talks about high turnover rate in the secret police, partly because of purges, partly because being in that position, being the type of people they were as a result of the absolute power they held, having so few restrictions and then suddenly running up against one of the very few restrictions that you have in the world. Surprisingly often they found themselves in prison. Quote, there were even instances when, as prisoners, they ran into Zeks being the nickname for political prisoners, who had once been under their thumb and came off badly in the encounter, end quote. Quote, before we go around flaunting too proudly the white mantle of the just, let everyone ask himself, if my life had turned out differently, might I myself have become just such an executioner? It is a dreadful question if one answers it honestly, end quote. It's like that cliché high school history class experiment. If you had lived in the Nazis' time, would you have been a Nazi? Solzhenitsyn takes a surprisingly charitable view of the Blue Caps, and admits that if things had turned out differently in his own life, he doesn't know what might have happened to him. Solzhenitsyn reflects on his time as an officer and the power and authority he got from the shoulder boards on his uniform that is the mark of being an officer. Talks about how arrogant he was, how he abused his power, how he was rude and cruel to his underlings, and expresses genuine regret for that. Tells the story of when he was arrested, he was in a group of 6. The people arresting him told him to carry his suitcase. And even though he was now under arrest, even though they had just ripped those shoulder boards off of his uniform, he pipes up and says, no, I'm an officer, let someone else carry it. And all the way as they marched, the other 5 prisoners took turns carrying his suitcase, and at the time he felt no remorse for it. It was just the mentality of being an officer and thinking that you're better than them. Might seem like a silly thing to feel so much regret for, but as C.S. Lewis says, the stain on your heart matters so much more than the magnitude of the crime. One of the most iconic quotes from this book comes in this chapter, quote, if only it were all so simple, if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were only necessary to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line between good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? During the life of any heart, this line keeps changing place. Sometimes it is squeezed one way by exuberant evil, and sometimes it shifts to allow enough space for good to flourish, end quote. The line between good and evil flows through the heart of every human. That's a warning to self-reflect, often, and to guard against evil, big or small, no matter what kind it is. If there was a big picture takeaway from the entire book as a whole, this would be it. This last part of the chapter is when Solzhenitsyn gets really philosophical. Quote, "It is, after all, only because of the way things worked out that they were the executioners and we weren't," end quote. Tells the story of when he himself had the opportunity to be recruited into the secret police. Also tells the story of someone else who, rather than being recruited, went to a doctor and begged him to diagnose him with something, so he had an excuse to avoid that position. Quote, "To do evil, a human must first believe that what he is doing is good," end quote. At this point, Solzhenitsyn draws comparisons with the Shakespeare characters Iago and Macbeth. Talks about how Macbeth, knowing he had done evil, was mentally consumed by it. Talks about how people need a justification before they could do an evil act. Quote, "Ideology is what gives evil its long-sought justification and gives the evildoer the necessary steadfastness and determination," end quote. Quote, "Thanks to ideology, the 20th century was fated to experience evildoing on a scale calculated in the millions," end quote. Solzhenitsyn even goes as far as saying that Shakespeare's evildoers were limited in the scope of their evildoing. Quote, "Just so long as the threshold of evildoing is not crossed, the possibility of returning remains, and he himself is still within reach of our hope. But when through the density of evil actions, the result either of their extreme degree or the absoluteness of his power, he suddenly crosses that threshold, he is left humanity behind, and without perhaps the possibility of return," end quote. That concept of a threshold for evildoing is an interesting one to play around with in your mind. Try self-reflecting on your own, I have a little bit, to see how true or false this is. It's certainly something that Solzhenitsyn would have had a lot more close encounters with than probably almost everyone listening right now, so I'm forced to take him at his word for this one. And I do, by the way, put a lot of stock into Solzhenitsyn's word. So how do we prevent the type of societal disaster that was the prison catastrophe of Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union? Solzhenitsyn has an answer, quote, "We have to condemn publicly the very idea that some people have the right to repress others. By keeping quiet about evil, by burying it so deep inside as that no sign of it appears in the surface, we are incorporating it, and it will rise up 1,000-fold in the future. When we neither punish nor reproach evildoers, we are not simply protecting their trivial old age. We are ripping the foundations of justice from beneath new generations. Young people are acquiring the conviction that foul deeds are never punished on earth, and that they always lead to prosperity. It is going to be uncomfortable, horrible to live in such a country," end quote. Jordan Peterson, by the way, takes this one step further by saying evil deeds are punished on this earth. The punishment is the spiritual state of living in that evilness. Gulag Archipelago, Chapter 5, First Cell, First Love. In this chapter, Solzhenitsyn goes over, what else? His first cell. Of course, people in the Soviet prison system were kept in many different cells for many different lengths of time, with varying numbers of other people in the cells. But, at least according to Solzhenitsyn, the first cell is always unique and inimitable. His first cell, of course, was in the Lubyanka during his interrogation. His description of meeting fellow political prisoners for the first time after the interrogation, quote, "Yes, that word which you may have despised out in freedom when they used it as a substitute for your own individuality. All of us like one another, we are deeply agreed, or we demand, or we swear, is now revealed to you as something sweet. You are not alone in the world, wise spiritual beings. Human beings still exist. We," end quote. He talks about the experience of switching cells for the first time and going to that first cell. For him, it was the middle of the night, after lights out, someone went into his room, told him, "Pick up your bedding." Describes how in the prison they kept the lights on at night so the guards could peek in the door and see what the prisoners were doing. Also, the prisoners were not allowed to sleep with their arms underneath the blanket, because they did not want to risk the prisoners strangling themselves. He gets to the new cell in the middle of the night. First question they always ask every new person in a cell, "Are you from freedom?" He describes how every new person always gives the answer, no matter how recently they were arrested. But then they soon get the story out of him, and he figures out that these new prisoners are one of the very few ways they get any news from outside the prison. After he gets to the new cell, of course, the other prisoners quickly want to go back to sleep, because he got there at night, and, of course, they keep the prisoners awake during the day. They value their sleep very much. Quote, "There was something alien in this frontline soldier who was my contemporary, and as far as he was concerned, I clammed up immediately and forever. I had not yet even heard the word nasidka, or stool pigeon, nor heard that there had to be one such stool pigeon in each cell. But a spiritual relay, a sort of sensor relay, clicked inside me, and it closed him off from me for good and all." End quote. That's how Solzhenitsyn describes his first interaction with the stool pigeon in his first cell. A stool pigeon, of course, is a fellow prisoner who, of course, on the outside is supposed to look like a fellow prisoner, but they are taking bribes from the guards in exchange for information. Quote, "All the efforts of the state security officers to employ stool pigeons began to seem to me as insignificant as being pestered by gnats. After all, a person who's undertaken to become a traitor always betrays the fault in his face or his voice, and even though some are more skilled at pretense, there is always something fishy about them." End quote. Solzhenitsyn talks about his own personal ability to sniff out stool pigeons. Quote, "I would not bother to recall this event if it had been the only one of its kind, but soon, with astonishment and alarm, I became aware of the work of this sensor relay as a constant inborn trait." End quote. Quote, "On the other hand, the sensor relay helped me distinguish those who I could, from the very beginning of our acquaintance, completely disclose my most precious depths and secrets to, secrets for which heads roll. Thus it was that I got through 6 years of imprisonment, 3 years of exile, and 6 years of underground authorship, which were in no wise less dangerous. During those years, I recklessly revealed myself to dozens of people and didn't make a misstep even once." End quote. Solzhenitsyn gives brief biographies of some of his cellmates. One of them is a man called Vishenko, who apparently knew Lenin. He was someone who traveled a lot during his time, including to some of the Western nations. Quote, "He was astonished by the free and easy, yet solidly established life in these countries, and he concluded that they would never have a proletarian revolution, and even that they hardly needed one." End quote. Another was a 36-year-old engineer, a very wealthy engineer, actually, during the wartime, chief engineer of some of the big construction projects outside Moscow, describes him as having, quote, "the virility of a Rasputin," end quote. This engineer cellmate, during the wartime, he was in the homeland, he was very rich and influential, and a lot of the other men were off on the front lines. Out of all those lonely women, he boasted about sleeping with almost 300 of them. He got arrested before number 300, and he was very sad about that. Solzhenitsyn describes a day in the life of one of these cells. Quote, "The 16-hour days in our cell were short events, but they were so interesting that I now find a 16-minute wait for a trolley much more boring. There were no events worthy of attention, and yet by evening I would sigh, because there had not been enough time. The events were trivial, but for the first time in my life I learned to look at them through a magnifying glass." End quote. They kept the prisoners in the cell 16 hours awake, 8 hours asleep, repeat. 1 pound of bread a day, and you had to decide when and how much you wanted to eat at each mealtime. 2 trips to the toilet a day, usually at the time that the guards changed their shifts, that was 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. Sometimes the toilet paper was pages that were ripped out of the book. Reading those pages and trying to figure out which book they went to was very exciting for them. Solzhenitsyn describes how little we consider the discomfort of needing to go and having to wait for one of the approved toilet times, sometimes for most of the day. I mentioned that the prisoners got 8 hours of sleep, or at least sleep-designated time. In previous chapters, we already saw how that goes during interrogation times. And I also mentioned that prisoners value their sleep very much. Quote, "One night of undisturbed sleep was more important than all the fates on the earth." End quote. Well, sleep deprivation was enough of an issue that each of the cell doors had a little tiny window on it that the guards could look through. They were supposed to go up and down the hallway, look through each window into each room once per minute, to make sure that the prisoners weren't doing anything they weren't supposed to, but also to make sure they weren't napping. Solzhenitsyn describes they got very good at entering quietly and hitting anyone who was asleep. I mentioned the 1 pound bread food ration already, but I did not yet mention how they would cast lots for it. Quote, "Where indeed in our country did this casting of lots not happen? It was the result of our universal and endless hunger. In the army, rations were divided up in the same way, and the Germans, who could hear what was going on in our trenches, teased us about it." End quote. Also talks about how the bread was low quality, more water than grain, and how they put additives in the bread now. Describes how the newer generations would not know what real bread was. They were allowed to read books in the cells, and whenever they got to a part of the book that just happened to mention some kind of food, any kind of food, it was like a new round of torture to them. Solzhenitsyn laments the conditions that Tsarist prisons used to be like back in Imperial Russia before the revolution. He recalls a time when there was an amnesty, meaning a lot of pardons were given out all at once. The prisoners back in the Tsarist time almost started a riot because they had to stay one extra day after the amnesty was declared. Meanwhile, one time there was an amnesty under Stalin and the prisoners had to wait 2 months before they were released. Talks about how kind the jailers were, how relaxed the conditions were. Quote, "One comes to the conclusion that anyone who does not escape is simply lazy because escaping was so easy," end quote. Also talks about how there used to be a Russian tradition to send gifts to unknown prisoners on holidays. Of course, anyone who did that nowadays would be tried under Article 58. He even describes a time before the revolution where girls would go in to visit a political prisoner who they did not know at all, tell the guards that they were the fiancé, and just, visit for a while, flirt a little. No more. Some of the less than ideal conditions of the prison. The prison doctor was completely uncaring. Toothache, extracted. The prison doctors also worked closely with the interrogators because the interrogators would frequently beat prisoners almost to death. They needed the doctor there to make sure the prisoner stayed alive for as long as possible. No escaping the pain. And whenever a prisoner was accidentally beat to death, the doctor would help out the interrogator by prescribing a different cause of death during the autopsy. In addition to that, they kept a very tight lid on communication between cells, to the point where the walls were reinforced to dampen the sound, and you could be punished for tapping Morse code onto the walls. The cell would also get collective punishment if, when they took one of the books back after the end of the week, they would go through the books, of course, and if they found anything that looked like a pinprick under certain letters, like you were trying to spell out a message, collective punishment for the cell for that. I mentioned books. Yes, the prisoners did have a right to books. There were certain things in the Soviet prison system that they kept to keep up the pretense of their prisoners being treated humanely. One of those was they had a right to read. It was 1 book per person, and they would keep the book for a period of 10 days. They would switch out the entire cell's books on the same day. So in that way, you were at an advantage if your cell had a lot of people in it because you could read a book and then trade with your friends. You could also put in a request for certain books. Sometimes they listened, sometimes they didn't. He had a theory that the prison library got their books from confiscated private libraries, thus, a lot of forbidden books were available to the prisoners. Quote, "Some people wisecracked that they allowed us to read forbidden books because they regarded us as already dead. But I, for one, think that the Lubyanka librarians had no concept of what they were giving us. They were just lazy and ignorant," end quote. I mentioned they had rights to keep up pretenses. Yes, you may be surprised to learn the prisoners had a right to petition. Once a month, they take them to a room with a tiny piece of paper, 7 by 10 centimeters, which comes out to about 3 by 4 inches, and of course the paper was low quality, so the ink would bleed through. You could send this letter to anyone you wanted. Stalin, Beria, Abakumov. I've gone over what those people were like. The prisoners also had a right to take a walk outside once a day. Described how good it was to actually see the sun and feel the outside air. Also described how they would save important conversations for during this walk, because it was a time when they were sure they weren't being listened to by a secret microphone or by a stool pigeon. During the walk, the guards tried to direct them to make a lot of fast turns, go at a fast pace, trying to make them lose their sense of direction. Solzhenitsyn, though, came up with a system where he would start with the number 0, and for every left turn, -1, for every right turn, +1, and in that way he could orient himself of the cardinal directions. One of the cellmates that joined their cell later in Solzhenitsyn's stay was Yuri. He was a Russian soldier who spent 2 years in a German POW camp. Describes how Russian POWs were treated worse than other nations' POWs during World War II. This was because Russia did not sign on to the Hague Convention. This meant that when Russians captured other nations' soldiers, they did not have any standards, any international laws for how to treat those prisoners of war, and vice versa. When Russians were captured by the Germans, all bets were off. The Russians were not fed enough to survive, and they did not get packages from the Red Cross. Which means if you didn't want to starve, you had to figure out some other way to get food and survive. You could be a translator, you could agree to try to be a spy. You had a handful of options, but you had to figure something out. Yuri, for his part, was a painter. He got by painting portraits for some of the German officers in exchange for food. There was another reason that Russia did not sign on to that Hague Convention, quote, simply in order to prevent rumors about the good life of war prisoners, inducing our soldiers to surrender willingly, end quote. That new cellmate, Yuri, felt extremely betrayed by the Soviet government. agreed to help the Germans train Russian spies. In fact, he became the main teacher in a spy school. Of course, most of the Russian POWs that agreed to go into this spy school, they were given assignments to go across behind enemy lines, well, Russian lines, to try and sabotage the Red Army, and they would immediately surrender to the Red Army. Little did they know that they would get pinned with Article 58 anyway, and they would go to Gulag. One day, a Russian intelligence operative, undercover of course, makes his way into the German POW camp, has a conversation with Yuri, tells Yuri that the Soviet government will forgive everything if he comes back to the motherland immediately. Quote, "So immutably does a human being surrender to the mist of the motherland. Just as a tooth does not stop aching until the nerve is killed, so is it with us. We shall probably not stop responding to the call of the motherland until we swallow arsenic." End quote. Yuri ultimately decides to go back to the motherland and take his entire spy school with him. Under the impression that he will be given amnesty, he goes back, he answers all the questions that the Soviets ask him, and then Smersh, did you see the supplemental video on Smersh? Yes, Smersh takes him to prison. He's charged with 58, as are everyone in that spy school. Solzhenitsyn rounds out the chapter by talking about some of the political arguments that they had on an almost daily basis, describes how good news can become bad news for prisoners and vice versa, as opposed to when they were in freedom. Solzhenitsyn asserted, at the time at least, that the revolution itself was not corrupt from the beginning, but it only got corrupted around 1929. Yuri and Vizhenko, on the other hand, they are a lot more jaded about the state of the Soviet government. Yuri believes that after Germany is defeated in World War II, the Soviets will immediately go to war with America, and America will easily win. Solzhenitsyn believes that Russian soldiers are made of tougher stuff than that, but Yuri, on the other hand, has seen how famished the Red Army is and how quick they are to desert a lot of times. Solzhenitsyn also has hints of socialism left in him at this point. He mentions being a fan of Gorky. Yuri is a lot bigger fan of Tolstoy. I also like Tolstoy. The prison being located in Moscow, they could hear what was going on outside. This included when the city was celebrating something. The prisoners inside, having not really much news from anywhere, would try to guess what the city was celebrating each time. They learned the number of shots in a gun salute to signify that a city in Europe had fallen, or a capital city, that the Red Army had taken it. They would try to guess which cities were taken and which ones were still resisting. By the time they got to VE Day and Germany was finally defeated, there were fireworks in the city all night. Quote, "That victory was not for us, and that spring was not for us either." End quote. Chapter 6 of the book is titled That Spring, meaning spring of 1945. Following the victory in Europe, Solzhenitsyn talks about a large, actually massive wave of former prisoners of war. These were Russians that fought in the Red Army and were captured by the Germans, and now they were rescued. They went back to Russia. And then they got funneled into the Gulag. That is the main focus of this chapter. And Solzhenitsyn was alongside them, not having been a prisoner of war himself. Simply an officer that got caught sending politically verboten letters to the wrong person. He describes being stored in the Butyrka prison during the month of June while they were able to hear marching bands on the streets of Moscow outside. And along with prisoners of war, Stalin's government also had a big focus on arresting Russians who had lived abroad for any considerable length of time, or really any length of time. Quote, "That tedious prison spring had, to the tune of victory marches, become the spring of reckoning for our entire generation." Unquote. So why did the Soviet government put their own prisoners of war, as well as their own expats, into gulags? Well, Solzhenitsyn emphasizes it was because they had seen too much of Europe. They don't want them bringing ideas back home to the Russian populace. They want to control the thought of the general population. Quote, "I was one who had smuggled weapons into Buchenwald and joined the Communist Party there, and it was we who were now in disgrace because we had survived. Those prisoners who had been in Buchenwald and had survived were now imprisoned for that very reason in our very own camps." End quote. Solzhenitsyn, and indeed many of the prisoners themselves, felt that the Russian government had betrayed their own soldiers, the people who fought to defend it. Quote, "The first time the motherland had betrayed them was on the battlefield through ineptitude. The second time was when she abandoned them to die in captivity, and the third time was when, with motherly love, she coaxed them to return home and snared them as soon as they reached the frontiers." End quote. Solzhenitsyn reflects, quote, "My own story of landing in prison seemed insignificant. I stopped regretting my torn-off shoulder boards. It was mere chance that had kept me from ending up exactly where these contemporaries of mine had ended, end quote. Quote, it is very naive to say what for. At no time have governments been moralistic. They never imprisoned people and executed them for doing something. They imprisoned and executed people to keep them from doing something, end quote. Solzhenitsyn mentions an old man, a Soviet worker who had been in prison before a lot of those POWs. Quote, I was very much taken with him. It was as if the whole Russian people were embodied there before my eyes in that one thick-set torso with that intelligent head and the arms and legs of a plowman. He had already thought through so much. It was from him I learned to understand the world, end quote. This man enlightened a lot of the prisoners on the corruption of Stalin and of the Soviet government. However, he surprised a lot of people when he first said that those accused of 58-1B were indeed genuine traitors. Quote, how easily we let ourselves be taken in by partisan labels, how easily we argue to regard those devoted men as traitors, end quote. The author uses that to illustrate how not everyone in prison, not all the political prisoners, were on the same page about who was innocent and who was genuinely a traitor. Quote, what depths of enforced ignorance were achieved by the monstrous lies of the state. Even the most broad-minded of us can embrace only that part of the truth into which our snout has blundered, end quote. And this sort of created a minor divide between the religious political prisoners, the POW political prisoners, the engineer political prisoners. Quote, the Soviet person reasoned in the following way. I personally am innocent, but any methods are justified in dealing with those others, the enemies. The lessons of interrogation and the cell failed to enlighten such people. Even after they themselves had been convicted, they retained the blind beliefs of their days in freedom, belief of universal conspiracies, poisonings, wreckings, espionage. End quote. Russian prisoners of war in World War II were treated notoriously a lot worse than any other nationality of POW. Quote, Western prisoners of war did not have to lower themselves to accept ladlefuls from German soup kettles. They talked back to the German guards. Western governments gave captured soldiers their seniority rights, their regular promotions, even their pay. The only soldier in the world who cannot surrender is the soldier of the world's one and only Red Army, end quote. Why is this? Well, there's a few reasons. First and foremost, Joseph Stalin did not sign on to the Hague Convention, which was one of the international conventions, and one of the subjects in the Hague Convention was prisoners of war. This meant that Russia could do whatever they want to captured enemy soldiers. There's no standard they had to follow. More importantly, Germany could do whatever they want to captured Russians. This is what Stalin intended. He wanted his own army to be afraid to surrender. So why did Stalin want Russian POWs to be treated worse by the Germans? He wanted that fear factor, first of all, so they would not abandon the Red Army. He didn't want them to retreat. He wanted them to die fighting. A more important reason in Stalin's mind, though, was he did not want them coming back into Russia with stories about how good the West was. It was bad for party propaganda and the party message if anyone said anything good about anything that went on in a capitalist country. Furthermore, a narrative spreads in the Soviet Union that soldiers who did not die fighting on the battlefield did not try hard enough if they got captured. Soldiers who survived German POW camps, well, that's suspicious. Why did you survive? Did you have a deal with the Germans? And if they managed to escape, well, that's suspicious. How did you escape? Why did you make it back and so many other people didn't? Are you a spy? Solzhenitsyn accuses Stalin of no less than treason for making life so hard for POWs. Hitler had at least some understanding of Stalin's mindset and the amount of paranoia in Stalin's mind. He played into this. As often as he could, he would bribe captured Russians with food. Hey, do you want to come work for the Germans? Do you want to fight in one of these Russian liberation battalions? Do you want to become a spy? Do you want to go back behind Russian lines and do some sabotage mission? We can get you out of camp, we can feed you, we can help you survive. And a lot of captured Russians did that kind of stuff just for safety. A lot of them took spy missions, went back behind Russian lines, and then the first chance they got, they surrendered to the Red Army. Hitler understood this. He knew that 90% or more of those Russians would surrender to the Red Army first chance they got. But here's the thing, it played into his strategy. He was playing off Stalin's paranoia. He looked for spies and traitors everywhere. And to some extent it worked. Did Smersh not arrest Solzhenitsyn, a good Russian officer who did good fighting, and would have continued doing good fighting, except that the Soviet Union was so paranoid about traitors? Of the Russian prisoners of war who were liberated from German camps when the Red Army took over the eastern part of the Reich, of course their options were either starvation diet, because they didn't get Red Cross handouts because Stalin didn't sign on to the Hague Convention, or they could make a deal with the Germans, do some kind of work for the Germans in exchange for food. So when the Red Army, quote-unquote, liberated all of those prisoners, a lot of work went into figuring out which of them did any kind of work at all that benefited the Germans. Solzhenitsyn describes a process of needing to prove your innocence without being let out from behind bars. And the way this was done, you need eyewitnesses, so you need to name names of people who were in the camp with you and could testify that you did not do work for the Germans. Now, this person might be in some completely different Russian prison camp, so you name the name to the interrogator sends away, figures out where that person is, they do an interview with him. This process lasted over a year before they got everyone processed. Solzhenitsyn talks about the man himself, Vlasov. He had a military career in the Red Army, spent some time in China in the 1930s working his way up the ranks. He was in the right place at the right time to get promoted and replace some of the generals that Stalin purged in the late 30s. During Hitler's advance into Russia, Solzhenitsyn praises Vlasov's skill as a general, saying he was one of the only fighting groups to not retreat but in fact advance in the face of the enemy. When so many other parts of the Russian line were retreating, this created sort of a Battle of the Bulge situation, where Vlasov was cut off from the rest of the Red Army, but Stalin ordered him not to retreat. Solzhenitsyn accuses Stalin of no less than treason for this. But this situation of being cut off from the rest of the army, that is how Vlasov gets captured. Ultimately defects to the German army, as you may know. Now, there were Russians fighting the Red Army before Vlasov, there were Russians fighting the Red Army that had nothing to do with Vlasov, but because he was such a high-profile general, his name became sort of a catch-all for all Russians fighting the Red Army. If you'll remember, Solzhenitsyn himself was an officer in the Red Army. He talks about his own encounters with Vlasov men. Quote, "We soon discovered that there really were Russians fighting against us. And they fought harder than any SS men," end quote. Gives a lot of examples of Russians fighting against them that did really heroic things. Perhaps they really believed in the cause they were fighting for, that might have been part of it, but mostly they understood they were committing treason, they understood they would get no mercy at all. Quote, "In Russian captivity, as in German captivity, the worst lot of all was reserved for Russians. In general, this war revealed to us that the worst thing in the world was to be a Russian," end quote. He remembers people in SS uniforms. As soon as they say one Russian word, they got shot on sight. Those were the lucky ones. Often, as prisoners of war, other officers would treat them very inhumanely, and hey, because it's Stalinist Russia, no one is allowed to speak up. Everyone's afraid to speak against the narrative. These are enemies of the people. Interestingly enough, despite making such wide use of Russians in the German army, Hitler still did not completely trust them and did not organize them into large divisions until close to the end. Quote, "Hitler and those around him, even when they were retreating on every front and were staring their own destruction in the face, could still not overcome their intense distrust of wholly separate Russian units. They could not bring themselves to organize divisions that were entirely Russian, to allow even the shadow of a Russia that was not totally subject to them," end quote. Quote, "Only in the fall of 1944 did they begin to form Vlasov divisions that were entirely Russian," end quote. As for what happened to the man, the myth, the legend, Vlasov himself at the end of the war, that's an interesting story. When the Germans were retreating from the city of Prague, they had plans to destroy the city rather than letting the Russians take the fully intact city. Vlasov was the one who stopped them. Yes, Vlasov's division turned against the Nazis, defended the city of Prague, and then, of course, when Vlasov's division itself came into the hands of the Soviets, well, you can imagine. Quote, "Did all Czechs realize later which Russians had saved their city? Our own history is similarly distorted. We claim that Prague was saved by the Soviet armies, although they could not have gotten there in time." End quote. Now, there were a lot of Russian prisoners of war in German camps who wanted to avoid going back to Russia after the war. There were a lot of Russians abroad in Europe for various reasons who wanted to stay out of the Soviet Union. And, of course, you can probably guess there were a lot of Vlasov men who the very last thing they wanted to do was go back to the Soviet Union. Solzhenitsyn mentions something interesting. During the Yalta Conference, one of the things they agreed on was that Vlasov men captured by the Western Allies would be returned to Russia by those Western governments. So Russian prisoners of this time have no love at all for Churchill or Roosevelt because of this. Russians also see Roosevelt and Churchill as being sort of idiots for allowing Stalin to eat up so much of Eastern Europe. Solzhenitsyn tells the story of a group of Vlasov men being led to the rear by a group of Red Army soldiers. One of them sees a tank passing nearby and takes the opportunity to commit suicide by throwing his body under the tank. The number of Vlasov men, by the way, was in the six figures, hundreds of thousands. Why were there so many of them? Quote, "Perhaps there is something to ponder here. Who is more to blame? Those youths or the grey fatherland? One cannot explain treason biologically. There has to have been a social cause." End quote. Now, at the end of the war, with so many Vlasov men filtering into the Russian Gulag system, Solzhenitsyn, who was a good little officer in the Red Army, finds himself in prison alongside all these people who fought against the Red Army. At the time of the war, there was a very large Russian diaspora in Europe. Quote, "The outflow from Russia of a significant part of her spiritual forces, which occurred in the Civil War, deprived us of a great important stream of Russian culture. Everyone who really loves that culture will strive for the reunion of both streams, the one at home and the tributary abroad. Only then will our culture attain wholeness. Only then will it reveal its capacity for benign development." End quote. Solzhenitsyn writes about the richness of literature and philosophy from that Russian diaspora. Stalin sought to unify both streams of culture, just not in a good way. The Soviet government took great efforts to bring expats back home, where they were immediately put into the Gulag system because they saw too many good things in Europe. This included Russians that had fought in the French resistance against Hitler, also Russians that had fought against Franco during the Spanish Civil War. There were also a number of Russians living in Shanghai. They got taken back later. Solzhenitsyn talks about the Vlasov men's attitude towards being in prison, talks about because they have no expectation for mercy, they are actually much better equipped psychologically to handle prison. Gives an example of one particular 60-year-old man, quote, "Among all of us in the cell, he alone did exercises every morning and washed himself at the faucet. The rest of us were trying not to squander the calories in our prison ration. He put his time to use. The difference between us and him was that we were all astonished at what was happening to us, while nothing around him contradicted his expectations, and precisely for that reason, he was absolutely alone in the cell." End quote. Quote, "His unimpaired consciousness of the correctness of his path in life lent him extraordinary strength." End quote. Now, a few short years after the war, with all of those people in prison, a very important date is coming up. 1947 marks the 30-year anniversary of the Glorious Revolution. The prisoners start rumors of a general amnesty where many prisoners will be released en masse. After all, supporters of the state are quick to speak up and say, "Hey, it's not like we never had an amnesty. In 1927 there was an amnesty." What was that amnesty like? Quote, Wyszynski presents the figures. In the 1927 amnesty, 7.3% of the prisoners were amnestied. This is a credible figure. Pretty poor for a 10th anniversary. Among the political prisoners, women with children were freed, and those who only had a few months left to serve. But in the middle of it, they began to regret even this wretched amnesty and began to break it. They delayed some releases, and some who were freed were given a minus restriction instead of full freedom to go where they pleased. End quote. The prisoners spent so much time hoping for an amnesty, it became sort of a mania, really. They just couldn't believe that so many millions of people would be kept in the prison system for so long. The guards, for their part, allowed them to hope for the amnesty for one reason or another. The truth was, the prison system had become an industry which had a demand for bodies to do labor. You remember in a previous chapter I talked about the gold mines in the Kolyma in the far, far east of Russia. The need for people to build and maintain those roads all the way east, and the need for people to work in those mines. Make no mistake, at this point Russia was economically dependent on the prison system. And the prison system needed a constant flow of fresh bodies to the point where police were given arrest quotas. On July 7th, 1945, there was at least a partial amnesty to celebrate the victory in Europe, which Solzhenitsyn promises to cover in more detail in a later chapter of the book. But Solzhenitsyn himself does not get an amnesty, he gets sentenced. Notable quote from this chapter of the book, quote, "There is a simple truth which one can only learn through suffering. In war, not victories are blessed, but defeats. Governments need victory, and the people need defeat. One victory gives rise to the desire for more victories. But after a defeat, it is freedom that the people desire, and they usually attain it. A people needs defeat just as an individual needs suffering and misfortune. they compel a deepening of the inner life and generate a spiritual upsurge." End quote. Gulag Archipelago, Chapter 7 in the Engine Room, Book 1. This chapter talks about sentencing in particular. Focuses a lot on judges as well as another legal entity called an OSO. The chapter picks up where the previous chapter left off. Solzhenitsyn and that other group of prisoners are awaiting their sentencing. They get called into the room one by one. Here's the paper, here's your sentence, sign on the dotted line, be quick about it, move along. Basically just hand each prisoner a paper, sign on the line, then you're done. Quote, "In olden times they used to beat the drums and assemble a crowd when a person was given a life sentence. Here it's like being on a list for a soap ration. 25 years and run along." End quote. Very impersonal. Most people never even saw the judge that gave them the sentence. There's no translation for people who don't speak Russian. Solzhenitsyn tells a story of one woman who recognized a typo on her piece of paper, was clever enough not to tell the person behind the desk about it. So in that way, she was sentenced to 5 years in Gulag instead of 15. Lucky her. Solzhenitsyn describes that after each person got their sentence, they would often laugh because, well, you can imagine what else is there to do in that kind of a situation than just laugh about it. You've done nothing wrong, you haven't even gotten to see a judge, you have never even been offered a defense lawyer. Yet here is a sentence for a decade or more in a Soviet gulag. Probably not many people listening will have any frame of reference for what that kind of thing is like. Quote, "This cleansing, relieving laughter was, I think, not really sick, but a living defense for the salvation of the organism." End quote. Solzhenitsyn describes the history of the Stalinist troikas, which are the legal bodies that do a lot of the sentencing for criminal cases. They are above all secretive. Quote, "The heart of the matter is not personal guilt, but social danger. One can imprison an innocent person if he is socially hostile, and one can release a guilty man if he is socially friendly." End quote. There were supposedly meetings and deliberations on each case. Quote, "However, it would not be a miracle if we should learn someday that there were never any sessions, and it was only a staff of experienced typists comprising extracts from non-existent records of proceedings, and one general administrator who directed the typists." End quote. And if anybody said that there should be more transparency in that process, one of the common arguments that Orthodox Soviets would give is that they need to keep certain things a secret because our enemies might find out. Which enemies? What would they do with that information? Well, who knows? The OSO was a special legal tool in Stalinist Russia, used a lot in their criminal quote-unquote justice system. They were able to do extrajudicial sentencing. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to say sentencing. They don't sentence a person, they impose an administrative penalty. It's not sentencing. Therefore, they don't need a real court and a real judge for it. OSOs are allowed to operate completely behind closed doors. Prisoners cannot appeal these decisions. They cannot face their accuser face to face. There is no jury, no defense lawyer, no public engagement. We've heard from previous chapters that torture, at least on paper, was not allowed, but in practice, everyone got tortured during their interrogation. Solzhenitsyn does some reflecting on Dostoevsky, a past famous Russian writer. Quote, "Dostoevsky dreamed of a court in which everything central to the defense of the accused would be set forth by the prosecutor. How many eons will we have to wait for that?" End quote. Stalinist judges as well as OSOs liked to work behind closed doors as often as possible. They often succeeded in this. They did not like facing public scrutiny. Also, the verdicts and sentences that got handed down in all but name were pretty much predetermined. Quote, "Just take the jurist side for a moment. Why, in fact, should a trial be supposed to have two possible outcomes when our general elections are conducted on the basis of one candidate? An acquittal is, in fact, unthinkable from an economic point of view. It would mean the informers, the security officers, the interrogator, the prosecutor's staff, the internal guard in the prison, and the convoy had all worked to no purpose." End quote. Why would any member of a jury vote not guilty after they've been reliably informed by daddy government that this person is in fact guilty? Voting to acquit would be pretty suspicious. Solzhenitsyn talks about more ridiculous charges and punishments. One could be denounced and charged with subversion if they simply said the Americans had good roads or that the Germans had good tanks. One could face a criminal charge for saying that they might not win the war. Are you doubting the Soviet grand strategy? And this charge of subversion, what did it mean anyway? Quote, "Did subversive refer only to someone who blew up rails with TNT? It didn't say. What was a subversive? Was someone subverting the authority of the government, for example, in a conversation on a streetcar? Or if a girl married a foreigner, wasn't she subverting the majesty of the motherland?" End quote. Purity spiral is one word for it, witch hunt is another word for it. You can see how this race to be the perfect little Soviet just went on and kept eating up more and more people's lives. Towards the end of his term, Solzhenitsyn had a unique opportunity to sit and hear the gossip of a circle of 70 judges in a room. He learned one interesting thing from this, that the judges to some extent were subservient to state security. They sort of undermined the judges' ability to make their own decisions in the cases. Judges who were too lenient, yes, in Stalinist times it was possible for a judge to be too lenient. If you were too lenient, you got some kind of penalty. Apparently, often, if they got removed from their judge position, they just became lawyers again. Quote, for several centuries we've had a proverb, don't fear the law, fear the judge. But in my opinion, the law has outstripped people, and people have lagged behind it in cruelty. It is time to reverse the proverb, don't fear the judge, fear the law. Abakumov's law, of course, end quote. When Solzhenitsyn was talking to these judges, something else happened. For context, Solzhenitsyn also wrote a book called A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. That's a short fictional story which described what else a day in the life of a prisoner in a Soviet camp. The prisoner's name is Ivan Denisovich. Quote, they stepped into the rostrum and talked about Ivan Denisovich. They said happily that the book had eased their consciences. That's what they said. They admitted that the picture I painted was on the bright side, that every one of them knew camps worse than that, end quote. Quote, of the 70 people seated around that horseshoe, several turned out to be knowledgeable in literature, even a few readers of Novinia. They were eager for reform. They spoke forcefully about our social ulcers, about our neglect of our rural areas. And I sat there and thought, if the first tiny droplet of truth has exploded like a psychological bomb, what will happen in our country when whole waterfalls of truth burst forth? And they will burst forth. It has to happen, end quote. Chapter 8, The Law as a Child. In this chapter, Solzhenitsyn goes over the early stages of the law that is Soviet criminal code, this time in the years immediately following the revolution. Quote, if they demand that we forget even the public trials, we forget them. The proceedings were open and were reported in our newspapers, but they didn't drill a hole in our brains to make us remember, and so we forgot them. Only things repeated on the radio day after day drill holes in our brain, end quote. A quote showing one of the ways that history is manipulated in the way that the state wants people to forget what the state wants them to forget, even if it used to be public knowledge a decade or two ago. One of the things that the Russian people in the 1940s seem to have forgotten was the amount of peasant revolts in the early 1920s immediately following the revolution. Not all Russians immediately liked the results of the revolution in Moscow. Lots of them had to be convinced to like it at the point of a gun. Quote, they did not adorn the pages of the official histories of the Civil War, and even though no one photographed them, and no one filmed motion pictures of those furious crowds attacking machine guns with clubs, pitchforks, and axes, and later lined up for execution with their arms tied behind their backs, end quote. The rural farmers from 1918 to 1921 were not having this whole workers' revolution thing. The workers in Moscow, however, labeled them kulak revolts, and switched up the political narrative to say that the rich landowners had incited the peasants to revolt against their own self-interest. Of course, over time, the definition of kulak would expand to include more and more people. Solzhenitsyn tries to undertake the task of understanding these first few years of the Soviet system, understanding how the law and the criminal code evolved during that time, immediately finds that there are gaps of information in the public record. For instance, at the time, courtrooms relied on stenographers. Those are note keepers who could write as fast as someone could speak, using a specially developed form of writing. If you were paying attention during my Dostoevsky book reviews, you'll remember that he married a stenographer and wrote some of his book by speaking out loud to his wife the text of the book while the wife wrote the book down. Well, that's how they did it in the courtroom in the first few years after the revolution. They had someone there who could do that, but a lot of those records were missing. They just disappeared. Some of them, the trial was conducted without a stenographer, imagine that. Some of them, the records were unreadable. There was a technical issue. Some of them, Solzhenitsyn was just told it was inconvenient to publish stenographic records. So where does Solzhenitsyn go to get information about these early court proceedings? Well, do you remember our friend from the supplemental episode, Nikolai Krylenko, chief prosecutor during the time of Vladimir Lenin, the guy who was notorious for going on rants about Christianity and literally frothing at the mouth in the middle of the courtroom, ranting about how bad religion is? Yes, that guy, that very same Nikolai Krylenko, he wrote a pretty lengthy text of prosecutorial speeches during these trials, and that book by Krylenko was the source for a lot of Solzhenitsyn's information that he puts in this chapter. Quote, "If we are determined to get a feeling for the judicial atmosphere of the first pre-revolutionary years, we must learn to read this Krylenko text. We have no other. And using it as a basis, we must try to picture everything that is missing from it, and everything that happened in the provinces too." End quote. Quote, "To pursue this enterprise of many years' duration is the rewarding task of a historian. As for us, how are we to make our way through the rosy mist? Whom are we to ask about it? Those who were shot aren't talking, and neither are those who were scattered to the four winds, even if the defendants and the lawyers and the guards and the spectators have survived. No one will allow us to seek them out." End quote. So this book by Krylenko is really the best source of information available. Just to remind you about Krylenko, who he is, he was a renowned legal scholar, at least by Soviet standard, probably the central figure in shaping 1920s Soviet criminal code. Here's a few quotes from Krylenko. Quote, "A tribunal is an organ of the class struggle of the workers directed against their enemies, and must act from the point of view of the interests of the revolution." End quote. Quote, "People are carriers of specific ideas." End quote. Quote, "Only one method of evaluating him is to be applied. Evaluation is from the point of view of class expediency." End quote. Quote, "We protect ourselves not only against the past, but also against the future." End quote. So Krylenko viewed the courtroom and legal action as being not something that seeks out guilty people who have done something wrong, but by his own admission, it's a tool to weed out people who are likely to do something wrong, likely to spread bad ideas. Anti-revolutionary thought, so the Soviets would say. Solzhenitsyn goes through a few examples of court cases from this Krylenko text. One of these, in 1918, was a trial against a newspaper for publishing something that was, quote, "relevant to public interest, but not necessarily the opinion of the editor." End quote. So in other words, they published a letter to the editor that was, sorta thought crimey. Hey, this newspaper office doesn't necessarily agree with this, it's just something one of our readers sent in that we thought it would be handy to publish. Yeah, no, Krylenko was not having that. The newspaper was shut down, and the editor was given solitary confinement. Solzhenitsyn also mentions that by the time that man's term expired, just the way Soviet criminal code worked, they likely found another excuse to pin some other charge on him and get him a repeat term. There were also several trials against interrogators, prison staff, for taking bribes from family members of prisoners in order to get leniency for their imprisoned family member. Krylenko wanted to crack down on that. Krylenko and the Soviet system was also not a fan of anything that could get any kind of leniency or better treatment for the prisoners. Before the revolution, Imperial Russia, years gone by, there was a tradition of people sending gifts to political prisoners, complete strangers, getting visits from complete strangers. Under Krylenko, they organized trials for people who passed the hat around, collected money to donate to prisoners' commissary funds. Conscientious objectors, of course, were not treated well. I mentioned the Tolstoyans. Those were the Christian followers of the ideas of the Russian writer Tolstoy. One of their beliefs was nonviolence. Nope, none of that. These people were called deserters, despite the fact that they had never enlisted. At least not willingly, and a lot of those people were executed. I think I mentioned before just how much Krylenko loved Christianity. There was a case where a bunch of blue caps went into a place of worship and desecrated some of the holy relics. There is mentioned a holy chalice or cup or something like that. It's Eastern Orthodox. They take these physical objects pretty seriously. They have a lot of paintings, icons, other relics. Well, a group of state officers entered and allegedly they spit into a holy chalice. So what happens with this in the year 1920 in Russia? The monks, for protesting against it, were put on trial. That's right, the monks, and then they kindly asked those state officers whether or not they had desecrated relics. No, we promise we didn't. Okay, the court believes you. Of course, the year 1920 in the Soviet Union, the state issued a liquidation of church relics. Whether they were getting desperate looking for gold even back then, or whether they just wanted to abuse Christianity, or maybe a combination of both, take your best guess. Do you, by chance, remember Maxim Gorky, that is the socialist Russian writer who Solzhenitsyn looked up to in his younger years? He had a love-hate relationship with the Soviet criminal system because he was a fan of free speech, despite being a socialist. Well, this guy Gorky, small world I know, apparently was a personal acquaintance of Vladimir Lenin, wrote a few letters to Lenin protesting the arrests of intelligentsia in Moscow. Now, this was the early years after the revolution. People were still used to the world being, normal. Still used to thought crime not being a thing. Lenin's response to Gorky wound up in the newspaper. Quote, "In actual fact, they are not the nation's brains, but shit," end quote. Quote, "If we break too many pots, it will be the intelligentsia's fault," end quote. Quote, "If the intelligentsia wants justice, why doesn't it come over to us," end quote. Lenin goes on to call them rotten liberals, pious, slovenly, and says that they betrayed the cause of the workers. Chapter 9, The Law Becomes a Man. This chapter, Solzhenitsyn continues exploring the evolution of the law, goes over a bunch of cases in the 1920s. Most notable among them, at least I thought, is the case against the church. How that started was a famine in the Volga region. Apparently it was bad enough that there was widespread cannibalism. Quote, "It was the result of productivity being reduced to zero. The working hands were all carrying guns. And the result also of the peasants' utter lack of trust and hope that even the smallest part of the harvest would be left for them," end quote. Solzhenitsyn blames the famine on the revolution itself. Now the Soviet government, even as early as that, decides to kill two birds with one stone, create a scapegoat for the famine to deflect blame, and try to strike a blow against the church. Quote, "Let the priests feed the Volga regions. They are Christians. They are generous," end quote. And suddenly the political narrative starts talking about what the church owes to the starving people in the Volga. Quote, "One must also picture the situation of that unfortunate patriarch, not elected to his post until after the October Revolution, who had for a few short years led a church which was always persecuted, restricted, under fire, and whose preservation had been entrusted to him," end quote. That's in reference to the patriarch, the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church at the time, when Lenin's Soviet government was pressuring the church to sell off some of the gold, some of the relics in the churches, and use the money to pay to feed the starving people in the Volga during a famine. They found themselves in a bit of a pickle. Among other things, the Soviets attempted to appeal to the Archbishop of Canterbury and to the Church of Rome for help, and the Soviet newspapers were loudly saying that if they don't give, then they're responsible for the famine. The consensus was they were willing to give it all, but they draw the line at forced requisition. If the Soviets take it at gunpoint, then it's sacrilege, but if the priests give willingly, then it's fine. They gave an inch. When someone gives an inch to a Soviet, they will, of course, take a mile. So when the Soviets took church relics out of the churches, and they were going to melt down the gold into ingots to use as currency, the priests wanted to follow the gold and the relics all the way from the church to the mouths of the poor. They wanted to be in the room when the gold was being melted down, and then witness when it was used to purchase food for the starving people in the Volga. The newspapers, of course, spun this. There was outrage. Of course, one thing led to another, and the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church was put on trial in 1922. That is Patriarch Tikhon, more on him later. But he resisted, even in the slightest way, the party's enthusiastic efforts to feed the starving people of the Volga. He was guilty of being anti-worker. When they brought the Russian Patriarch into the courtroom, quote, "Even though the public was represented only by a carefully selected audience, nonetheless the stamp of old Russia was still so deep, and the Soviet stamp still so superficial, that on the Patriarch's entrance more than half of those present rose to receive his blessing," end quote. Significant to this case was a proclamation from the church regarding the difference between forced requisition versus voluntary giving from the church. Tikhon took full responsibility for that proclamation. He did not bring anyone else in the church down with him. "Yes, I wrote it myself, I edited it myself. I commanded for it to be published. It was all me." He was once asked directly, quote, "You therefore consider that the Soviet government acted incorrectly," end quote. Quote from Solzhenitsyn, quote, "A crushing argument. It will be repeated 1,000,000 times more in the affairs of nighttime interrogators, and none will answer so simply or straightforwardly as the Patriarch. Yes," end quote. Now, who's been brushing up on their Bible study? Matthew chapter 22, render unto Caesar. Patriarch Tikhon certainly knew his stuff. Quote, "I recognize state laws to the extent that they do not contradict the rules of piety," end quote. Quote from Solzhenitsyn, "Oh, if only everyone had answered just that way, our whole history would have been different," end quote. The Patriarch during his trial once again reaffirmed that church surrendering of holy relics was not sacrilege, but the Soviets seizing relics against the will of the church was sacrilege. Oh my goodness, you say the Soviet government acted incorrectly? Guilty. Prosecutor Krylenko in this case used a fuzzy definition of the word propaganda. Propaganda is an attempt to prepare a mood preliminary to preparing a revolt in the future. Under that definition, Patriarch Tikhon was guilty of planning a revolt against the Soviet government. Oh my goodness. Patriarch Tikhon's sentence from this trial was being confined to a monastery, which was actually pretty light compared to what it could have been, but then again, it was a very public trial in 1922, still pretty early in Soviet history. Several dozen church people were also charged, though, with resisting the requisition of church relics. And the Soviet news media labeled the Russian Orthodox Church as a subversive organization. There were some Soviet legal reforms during this part of the 1920s. The new law code included new crimes that warranted the punishment of execution. That included propaganda, or the appeal for passive resistance to the government, and it also included expats returning from abroad. Excerpt from a letter written by Vladimir Lenin. Quote, "The court must not exclude terror. It would be self-deception or deceit to promise this. And in order to provide it with a foundation and to legalize it in a principled way, clearly and without hypocrisy or embellishment, it is necessary to formulate it as broadly as possible, for only a revolutionary righteousness and a revolutionary conscience will provide the conditions for applying it more or less broadly in practice." End quote. In other words, terror is completely legal because the people at the bottom of the totem pole in the legal chain need the freedom, if they so choose, to apply it. We totally trust them to be principled with this. How do you think that turned out? Lenin, incidentally, 10 days after writing that, suffered from his first stroke. That excerpt from Lenin, though, served as the inspiration for what would later become Article 58 in the Soviet Criminal Code. Quote, "Whether a man whispered to his wife in bed that it would be a good thing to overthrow the Soviet government, or whether he engaged in propaganda during elections or threw a bomb, it was one in the same, and the punishment was identical." End quote. One example of that in practice was in the trial of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. That is another political party that was around at the time of the revolution. They were not Bolsheviks, though, but they were leftists. They opposed, among other things, sending gold and food to Kaiser Wilhelm during World War I, which Russia was allied with them at the time. Now, you may remember from previous chapters that the Soviets had a great interest in funneling all the members of those non-Bolshevik leftist parties into the Gulag system safely so they could not speak out. So, for that opinion on the food aid to Kaiser Wilhelm, they were put on trial for treason. Krylenko had a notoriously hard time pinning their guilt down during this trial. What they finally got him on was a record from one of their meeting minutes, where they flat out discussed the possibility of using terrorism, but they decided they would not do that unless the prisoners who were part of their party started being executed. Well, why not absolutely condemn terrorism? Why even consider terrorism in the first place? Gulag. Gulag Archipelago, Chapter 10, The Law Matures. I think most of you who have been following along this far in the book will not be surprised at how Soviet law develops in the mid-20s. Nevertheless, let's go through it anyway. To start off, in this chapter, Solzhenitsyn mentions 300 prominent Russian intelligentsia from Moscow, exiled not to Siberia, but sent abroad, mostly to Europe. That was Lenin's command carried out by Dzerzhinsky. I've been making supplemental videos about a few of them who were mentioned by name by Solzhenitsyn. He mentioned quite a few by name. I will continue to make more of those. Many of them were university people, prominent thinkers, theologians, etc. After they started exiling the prominent thinkers of Moscow in 1923, it was not long before the Soviets decided to reverse this policy. Quote, "It didn't work out constantly and systematically. Perhaps the frequency with which the émigrés announced that they regarded it as a gift made it apparent that this punishment left something to be desired, that it was a mistake to let go of good material for the executioner, and that poisonous flowers might grow on that European garbage dump. And so they abandoned this form of punishment, and all subsequent purging led to either the executioner or the archipelago." End quote. The archipelago, of course, meaning this network of prison camps that Solzhenitsyn describes. Solzhenitsyn also mentions that in 1936 they consolidated the criminal code into Article 58, which we've talked about already. This Article 58 continued throughout Stalin's time and into Khrushchev's time. This chapter presents a different view of Krylenko than was previously given. Of course, Chief Prosecutor, a prisoner writing about him. Initially, it's going to be a very intimidating, larger-than-life character, But in this and the previous two chapters, Solzhenitsyn switches gears a little bit. He's writing more as a historian than as a prisoner. In context of the chapter title, The Law Matures, quote, "But our law had finally matured and could show the world something really perfect, a big, coordinated, well-organized trial. This time a trial of engineers, and that is how the Shakti case came about," end quote. So we see this top-down desire from the state to show off the legal system. And of course, the guy who happens to be in the role of chief prosecutor has some pressure on him to put on a good show. And that is how we get into the 1928 Shakti trial. This was an economic wrecking trial. Of course, Krylenko was the accuser, Vyshinsky was the judge. There were 53 defendants. Notable among them was a man called Saratovsky. Now, if the goal is to put on a good show trial and show off the efficiency of the Soviet system, having as many as 53 defendants confused things a little bit, mostly because not all of them responded the same way to torture, and as a result, some of them had different pleas from each other, and this caused confusion, especially since newspapers were reporting on this. So the famous Shakti trial ended up being a little bit of an embarrassment for the state. And not just this trial, it takes a couple years for this system to get all the kinks ironed out. Solzhenitsyn speculates that it taking so long to get those kinks ironed out is one of the reasons Krylenko got purged by Stalin, because Stalin just lost patience. Quote, "It was necessary to create and uncover an engineer organization which encompassed the entire country, and for this purpose it was essential to have several strong, prominent wreckers at its head. And just what engineer was unaware of just such an unequivocally strong and impatiently proud leader? Pyotr Akimovich Palchinsky," end quote. Quote, "Krylenko's choice turned out to be a mistake. Palchinsky resisted every pressure the Ogpal knew and did not surrender. In fact, he died without signing any nonsense at all," end quote. Quote, "They proved that it was possible to resist and possible not to give in, and thus they left behind a spotlight of reproach to shine on all the famous subsequent defendants," end quote. In the shadow of the Shakti trial with Palchinsky and others, Krylenko did have quite a tough time with his assigned task in the late 20s, early 30s. And so we come to the November-December of 1930 Kromparty trial. This trial had 8 defendants, far fewer than the 50-some we saw in the Shakti trial. This trial does have stenographic records, so we do have a direct courtroom transcript here. Foreign spectators were also allowed to attend this trial. Now, because they had such a tough time keeping all the defendants and all the witnesses' stories straight, 8 defendants, a total of 7 witnesses, and a complete lack of documents proving that there was economic wrecking going on. Quote, "The best evidence, no matter what the circumstances, is the confession of the defendants," end quote. Who do you think said that one? Krylenko. But despite the complete lack of a paper trail to serve as material evidence, the trial went on. The effect of the very long testimonies of the defendants, Solzhenitsyn speculates this was by design, was to overwhelm the readers of the newspapers that were reporting on the trial with so much industry jargon and just length of testimony that their eyes would just glaze over it and they would completely miss that there was pretty much no evidence and the crimes were not severe at all. Really, these economic wrecking crimes just amounted to misallocation of resources in a lot of cases. Quote, "The defendant's words flowed in a business-like manner, cold and professional and calm," end quote. Solzhenitsyn tells us from the stenographic records that Vyshinsky actually had to keep telling them to speak louder so they could be heard. Quote, "The harmony of the trial was not at all disturbed by the defense, which agreed with all the prosecutor's proposals," end quote. I want to take a moment here to stop and go over what exactly is economic wrecking. Quote, "In order to make efficient use of single-track railroads, they decided to increase the size of locomotives and freight cars. And was that considered modernization? No, it was wrecking, because at that point it would have been necessary to invest funds into strengthening the rail bonds and the substructures of the bridges," end quote. There is a saying that I think is repeated more than once in this book, quote, "In America, capital is cheap and labor dear. Here it is just the opposite," end quote. Meaning in Russia they have a lot of hands to do things, but not much money or financial investment to go around. Another example of wrecking, or alleged wrecking. A warehouse was designed with high ceilings and proper ventilation so that the workers would not get overheated with the hottest days of summer in mind, Well, why invest all that money in such a big warehouse? Why can't the workers just sweat a little on the very hottest days of summer? That's wrecking. Solzhenitsyn describes these trials as a theatrical performance, literally, to the point where when people forget the details, they have to give the court a recess in order to go over what everyone is supposed to say. And we even see in some of the court transcripts Krylenko getting frustrated when people forget the proper cues. This was the case in the Promparty trial. And before the trial, when they were briefing the prisoners, they even said the quiet part out loud here, look, we know that none of this probably actually happened. But what's that phrase that comes up over and over? It is expedient to the party that this theatrical performance go as planned so that the public thinks what the party wants it to think. And to that end, they would torture the prisoners, they would threaten their lives, they would threaten their family members. They would do whatever it took to get the prisoners to agree to act out this theatrical drama. Now, growing out of this, something kind of funny actually happens. Quote, mercy for the defendants who cooperated in any trial was an important prerequisite for the success of the next trial, and hope was transmitted via that chain right up to Zinoviev and Kamenev themselves, end quote. So they would literally tell the prisoners, hey, look, the last guy who did this, he wasn't guilty either, but he went on with the trial anyway. He turned out okay, so just say what you're supposed to say during the trial, and we'll make sure you don't get punished too bad. Quote, the trial must work for the good of socialist society, end quote. Quote, the main thing for these strange defendants right at that moment, on the threshold of death, was to convince the people of the whole world of the infallibility and far-sightedness of the Soviet government, end quote. The Soviet Party wanted to be the ones wisely rooting out all these economic saboteurs. They're keeping the people safe, trust us. There were lots of these show trials in the late 20s, early 30s Soviet Union. The Shakhty trial and the Palchinsky trial, although we mentioned those two in a little more detail, they were far from the only ones, and indeed far from the only ones widely reported in Soviet newspapers at the time. The goals of these trials were to blame shortages on engineers, so the party has a way out, the party is not to blame, make the public fear the Soviets. They also wanted to make a show of force against the engineers and intelligentsia, so they know what was good for them. And finally, they wanted to make the people, the general public, willing to serve the party, willing to work for the good of the party. Make them feel national unity in a way that is beneficial to the party. Moving on to the next part of the chapter, in 1927 the Soviet government planned a 5-year plan. They thought they were going to manually manufacture economic prosperity, and they had enough control over the newspapers to at least make it look like they were successful. They started giving out really hilariously impossible tasks and goals to engineers in various industries. The engineers formed a planning commission to moderate these commands, and as much as we might think they would be instantly gulagged, the purpose of these planning commissions was actually beneficial to the party, because if too many of these goals failed in too obvious a way, the party would be publicly embarrassed and they would have to cover it up with a newspaper. Better to just listen to the engineers at least a little bit and give them halfway reasonable goals. And moving on one more time to yet one more trial, this time in 1937, the defendant is a man by the name of Vlasov, not to be confused with the World War II General Vlasov. Vlasov was accused of economic wrecking. What exactly did he do? He oversaw bread lines. Now, of course, there was no good reason for any Soviet citizen to go hungry. Oh no, there's plenty of bread. The Soviet government sees to that. It must have been one of these local administrators clogging up the works, and of course Vlasov got the short end of the stick on that. He, though, was not the most cooperative prisoner that the court system could have hoped for. For one thing, during his trial, he actually said that he wrote a letter directly to Stalin about the situation while it was going on, and he did not get a reply from Stalin. This lack of reply was an embarrassment to the party in itself, but later on Vlasov actually says the quiet part out loud about the nature of these trials. Direct quote from Vlasov, quote, I consider you not a court, but actors pretending to be a court in a stage farce where roles have already been written for you. You are engaged in a repulsive provocation on the part of the NKVD. You are going to sentence me to be shot no matter what I say. I believe one thing only. The time will come when you will be in my place. End quote. Quote from Solzhenitsyn. Generally speaking, he was wrong just on this last point." End quote. Only the good die young, apparently. They did actually sentence him to be shot. Quote, "After the solemn words, 'to be shot,' the judges paused for applause. But the mood in the hall was so gloomy, from the sighs and tears of people who had no connection to the defendant and the screams and swooning of their relatives, that no applause was to be heard even from the first two benches where the party members were sitting. This, indeed, was totally improper." End quote. Moments after that verdict was read out, they could hear the words, "Oh, good Lord, what have you done?" from somewhere in the crowd. The crowd in the courtroom created an uproar at that sentence. They actually had to get the guards in the courtroom to raise their guns and point them into the crowd. The crowd at this point panics and evacuates, starts jumping out windows and doors. The defendant did, in fact, get shot. They actually had to transport the defendant with an armed guard of 5 guards, just to make sure that public backlash and angry mobs didn't try to free the defendant, or rather the condemned at this point. One of the defendants had an 8-year-old daughter who, a year later, died of depression. She was getting bullied a lot in school as well. People telling her that, "Oh, your papa's a wrecker." "No, my papa's a good man." "No, he's a wrecker." The official cause of death for that 8-year-old was inflammation of the brain. Quote, "When we count up the millions of those who perished in the prison camps, we forget to multiply them by 2, by 3. End quote. Quote, "Every reasonable man will now agree that the NKVD could never have carried out its great assignment if they had fussed about with open trials. And that is why public political trials never really put down roots in our country." End quote. This also sets the stage in the late 30s going into the 40s in the Soviet Union for all these methods of extrajudicial punishments. Chapter 11 is titled The Supreme Measure, that is, capital punishment, in other words, the death penalty. Solzhenitsyn starts out by covering a brief history of the death penalty in Russia, much of which I've already covered in my History of Russian Prisons video. Catherine the Great, as we've covered before, was the longest Russia has ever gone without executing a prisoner. In the early years of Tsar Nicholas II, there was a relative slowdown in executions, but as the revolution started to heat up, so did the number of killings. In the years before the imperial government was overthrown, they saw hundreds of executions per year. The provisional government, after the February Revolution, briefly banned executions, but then later they reinstated it for the most extreme crimes, that is, rape, murder, looting, etc. Solzhenitsyn told this story as well in a previous chapter. Admiral Alexei Sloshny was a well-known early 1918 Russian execution, notably at a time when executions were banned under the law. He refused an order, he was put on trial, he was sentenced to be shot. The room goes silent. Everybody knows that they're not allowed to execute prisoners, but then, Chief Prosecutor Krylenko to the rescue. Why, yes, executions have been abolished, but he hasn't been sentenced to execution. He's been sentenced to be shot. Slow clap for Comrade Krylenko on that one. So in June of 1918, de facto executions were restored in the Soviet Union. The Soviet government did this frequently where they pretended they had human rights, they paid lip service to it, but then on the ground it's the most backwards regime you've ever seen. In the 16-month period between June of 1918 and October of 1919, an estimated 16,000 people were shot. Compared with the 80 years of the Spanish Inquisition, a total of 10,000 burning. Capital punishment was abolished in January of 1920, at least that's what the Soviet newspapers would have you believe. That abolition did not, however, apply to military tribunals on the frontier. And if you can believe it, prisoners were specifically sent there for that reason. That period of time, though, only lasted until May of the same year, that's 4 months. Quote, "The revolution hastened to rename everything so that everything would seem new. Thus, the death penalty was rechristened the supreme measure, no longer a punishment, but a means of social defense." End quote. The supreme measure, at least on paper, lasted until 1927 when it was abolished. Except for Article 58, crimes against the state, crimes against the army, military crimes, banditry. What constitutes banditry, you ask? Oh, well, that is a broad definition. Basically, any crime committed by someone on the frontier with a weapon becomes banditry. And in the late 1920s, yeah, looking at the wrong person the wrong way is a crime. Solzhenitsyn tells a story of over 200 people waiting for execution in Kresty prison in Leningrad in 1927, at the time when the supreme measure was supposedly outlawed. In particular, he highlights 6 peasants who, after they mowed one of the fields in the collective farm, They went over it a second time just to get those tiny pieces of wheat that they could still manage to get, so they would have something to take home. Gulag, theft from the state, 58. Quote, one must cherish the hope that one day documents will confirm the report of my witness, who is still alive, end quote. Quote, even if Stalin had killed the others, I believe he would deserve to be drawn and quartered just for the lives of those 6 peasants, end quote. Solzhenitsyn did not mince words, did he? This impressive-sounding term, the supreme measure, becomes colloquially known as the super by prisoners. And Solzhenitsyn talks about the years of 1937 and 1938, when he estimates 1.7 million people received the supreme measure. Solzhenitsyn believes that 28,000 per month or more people were executed in the Soviet Union during those years, helped along by the massive number of locations where these executions took place, locations such as former churches and basements of random government buildings. When the Soviet Union introduced the quarter term, the 25-year term, they did in fact quite benevolently once again eliminate the supreme measure, except 2 years later they brought it back for traitors of the motherland. And of course, they kept the quarter term on the books after they did that. And then later on in the 50s and 60s, they kept adding more things on that could qualify for the death penalty, things such as murder and theft of state property. Quote, whether our destiny holds a death sentence is not determined by what we have done or not done. It is determined by the turn of a great wheel and the thrust of powerful external circumstances. End quote. Solzhenitsyn gives the example of an engineer in Leningrad during the siege, who blew his nose in front of a window he was accused of giving a signal to a secret spy, using the handkerchief. They took him in, they asked him to name names, to give him names of everyone in his secret network of accomplices. They demanded as many as 40 names from him. He names a whole bunch of people, all of them get shot. Granted, this was during the war, but still. Solzhenitsyn speculates on what it must have been like to be on death row right up until the very end, right up until execution. Quote, only those who have been killed know it all to the very end, and that means no one, end quote. However, Dostoevsky did come pretty close. Solzhenitsyn covers in detail what it was like in the cells of prisoners who were waiting for death. There was overcrowding and freezing. They were kept in the cells for long periods of time, and they weren't given much more food than the average prisoner. Quote, it was winter, but in order to not be suffocated, the prisoners broke the glass on the windows, end quote. Quote, they waited such a long time after the death sentence had been imposed that their principal sensation was no longer the fear of being shot, but the pangs of hunger, end quote. The longest that Solzhenitsyn personally knows of was 75 days. However, a lot of people were kept there much longer. Was there medical attention? It's death row, what are you talking about? Technically, yes, of course, the Soviets are humanitarian, they give medical attention to prisoners. The doctors just plain do not care. The Soviet government would in fact encourage the prisoners to sign appeals, which they knew would take months to process, keeping them in there even longer. Sometimes when a prisoner did not want to file an appeal, the guards would do it for them. Solzhenitsyn tells one story of a prisoner on death row who got so bored waiting for the execution that he asked for a paper and a pencil and started doing actual scientific work. He was a scientist. His execution was actually commuted related to this, and the Soviet government gave him a career in his field. Hey, wow. Solzhenitsyn tells another story of a prisoner whose death sentence was not exactly real. Yes, he was taken to a courtroom. No, the trial was not binding. The judge, the jury, everyone was actors. In fact, the interrogators wanted him to truly believe that he had received a death sentence, but it was just an elaborate game. It was a tool to get a confession from him. The prisoners who were with him in his cell, who were of course paid, recorded the confession, and then he was given his real trial. Solzhenitsyn was actually quite the fan of Fed posting in his book. I'll give you an example. Quote, if the condemned men in every cell had ganged up on the executioners as they came in and choked them, wouldn't this have ended executions sooner than appeals to the Russian Central Executive Committee? When one is already on the edge of the grave, why not resist? End quote. Solzhenitsyn gives the answer to this why not resist. Quote, does hope weaken a man? End quote. Prisoners held on to hope for an appeal, hope for leniency. These hopes were rarely fulfilled. Meanwhile, the prisoners do not know the date of their execution. Every morning when the guard opens the door, that could be it. And so they learn to appreciate every morning. Quote, as for waiting a year or two, after all, we spend year after year waiting for the angel of death. Isn't our whole world just a death cell? End quote. Prisoners were often kept waiting on death row in those cells for long enough that they had to bring in a barber to give everyone in the cell a haircut. And as for the crowding, quote, though it has long been well known that even a corpse has a right to 3 arshiks of earth. In this cell, each one of the condemned has been allotted, while waiting for death, a little less than a third of that, end quote. And then when the guards finally come in to take someone whose time has come, quote, at the very first moment when the victim has been pointed out, the rest are relieved. It's not me. But right after he's been taken away, the rest are in a state that is hardly any easier to bear than his. All the next day, the ones left behind are destined to silence, and they won't want to eat. End quote. Solzhenitsyn tells a story of one man who was waiting on death row, was in the process of an appeal, but he had just reached his limit, actually spitting on the person who very well might have been handling his case at that very moment. Quote, there is a limit, and beyond it one is no longer willing, one finds it too repulsive to be a reasonable little rabbit. And that is the limit beyond which rabbits are enlightened with the understanding that all rabbits are foredoomed to become only meat and pelts, and that at best one can gain only a postponement of death and not life in any case. End quote. This same man, his death sentence was in fact commuted to 20 years. And what did he reply to that? Quote, it is strange. I was condemned for a lack of faith in the victory of socialism in our country. But can even Kalinin himself believe in it if he thinks that Gulag camps will still be needed in our country 20 years from now? End quote. Chapter 12, Churzak, which is the Russian word for jail. This chapter is basically the story of how Russian prisoners lost their rights and privileges as prisoners. Starts off by describing prison conditions towards the end of Tsarist times. Prisoners under Tsar Nick apparently were much more lenient. Prisoners could freely lend books from the library. There was gardening, there was unrestricted outside time. Visits and letters from family, military officers were treated with respect. Prisoners could read and educate themselves and each other. Contrast that with the horrors of Soviet prison and interrogation that we described earlier in this book. Prisoners where the cells are not allowed to communicate with each other very strictly. Prisoners get in trouble for even tapping on the walls because the guards think it might be Morse code. You have to wonder how that transition happened. Well, this chapter answers that. Quote, the weakening and shaking up of the Tsarist prison system did not come about on its own, of course, but because all society, in concert with the revolutionaries, was shaking it up and ridiculing it in every possible way. Tsarism lost its chance to survive, not in the street skirmishes of the February Revolution, but several decades earlier, when youths from well-to-do families began to consider a prison term an honor. End quote. Quote, the more the prison system weakened, the more clearly evident were the triumphant epics of the political prisoners, and the more visibly did the revolutionary parties realize their strength and regard their own laws as superior to those of the state. And that is how the Russia of 1917 arrived, bearing 1918 on its shoulders. End quote. Of course, when the Bolsheviks took over Russia, there was a mass emptying of political prisons, because, hey-ho, a lot of those people helped to overthrow the Tsar. There were also a bunch of humanitarian measures passed in addition to the already lenient prison conditions that were under the Tsar. Solitary confinement, no more. No more locked doors on cells. No more separating prisoners. Husband and wife were allowed to share the same cell. There were visits unrestricted. There were windows without bars. The food was good. There were unrestricted outdoor walks, and even when women got pregnant, they were allowed to leave prison and instead go into exile. That likely would have been in Siberia, but still. For all the amnesties that happened in 1917, though, by 1918, those political prisons had been refilled. Lots of social democrats, anarchists got rearrested. Quote, they all returned to prison with a consciousness of their rights as convicts and a long-established tradition for how to stand up for them. End quote. Very early on, the Solovetsky Islands, nicknamed Solovki, we talked about that in previous chapters, series of former monastery prison islands up north in the Baltic, they started being utilized as a prison pretty much right away. Quote, you couldn't be heard from there no matter how loud you shouted, and you could burn yourself up for all anyone would ever know. End quote. The Soviets liked it because it made the prisoners isolated from the rest of Russia. Communication was slow, and in fact, for half the year, letters couldn't even get through. It is here that the struggle of the prison authorities to take away the rights of the prisoners begins. The prison chief, by the name of Eichmann, started by restricting their right to unlimited time outside. They now were only allowed to go out during daylight hours that ended at 6 p.m. each day. The prisoners decided to protest this by all going outside at 6 p.m. at the same time as a big group. Well, 15 minutes before 6 p.m., the guards opened fire on the crowd. 6 killed, 3 wounded. Eichmann's the next day called it a horrible misunderstanding. We totally didn't mean for that to happen. Oh, we're so sorry. We'll give them all a funeral. Meanwhile, the newspapers over on the mainland slandered the prisoners, said that they were violent and they were starting a prison revolt. The prisoners, apparently not understanding what the Soviet government would become, they decide that they're still going to resist. They will deliver an ultimatum. If the prison does not restore the previous conditions, they would go on a hunger strike. A hunger strike by prisoners in 1918 in the Soviet Union went about as well as one would expect. Quote, "After all, they were well-fed, and there wasn't a peep from the capital newspapers about the hunger strike, and there were no student protest meetings. Silence was already confidently shaping our history." End quote. The prison authorities waited until the prisoners gave up, the strike ended, nothing was gained. Prison conditions continued on Soviet terms until the spring of 1925, when those same prisoners were removed from the Solovetsky Islands and taken to the Russian mainland. Now, at first, they thought they had won a victory. But then, en route, they realized that their leaders, their organizers, had been separated from the rest of the group. Quote, "Yogoda and Katanyan personally directed the incarceration of the former Solovetsky prisoners." End quote. In their new prisons, they lost freedom of movement, the cell doors were locked, and their communication was restricted. These Solovetsky prisoners were determined in their new prisons. They attempted to organize, they attempted to stubbornly keep their right to communicate cell to cell. Quote, "They shouted back and forth from window to window until a guard fired from his tower into the cells. In reply, they organized a protest. They broke window panes and sabotaged prison equipment." End quote. Solzhenitsyn explains that breaking windows in a Russian prison is a risky move because the Russian winter is coming, and there's no guarantee that the prison is going to replace that glass. Quote, "From our experience of the past and our literature of the past, we have derived a naive faith in the power of a hunger strike. But the hunger strike is a purely moral weapon. It presupposed that the jailer has not entirely lost his conscience, or that he is afraid of public opinion. Only in such circumstances can it be effective." End quote. Quote, "The Tsarist jailers were still inexperienced. They got nervous if one of their prisoners went on a hunger strike. They exclaimed over it. They put him in a hospital." End quote. In fact, many of the Bolsheviks knew and understood how the Tsarist jailers operated. They understood prison conditions better than most because, under Tsar Nicholas II, many of them did spend time in prison before being exiled. So in the late 1920s, they knew what they were doing when they made new rules about hunger strikes. Someone who starts a hunger strike must be put in solitary confinement. News of the hunger strike must not be given to the public. And the public, for those purposes, included other prisoners, even prisoners from the same cell as them. The excuse, the pretense they gave for this, was that so they can ensure that the person doing the hunger strike remained honest and did not cheat by eating something. And then in the beginning of the 1930s, they just straight out made hunger strikes illegal. That did not stop prisoners from trying to do it, though. Solzhenitsyn gives examples of people who still tried to do those hunger strikes. One person struck for 20 days for the delivery of one food parcel. You'll understand that food parcels from the Red Cross did not always make it through. Quote, "Was it worth it? After all, in the new prison, one's strength, once lost, could not be restored." End quote. The prison administration often tried to wait out the strikers, just wait until they got tired, got hungry, and they ate. They lied to strikers. He tells a story of one person who did a hunger strike because he wanted his wife to be told where he was. So the prison forged a fake telegram receipt to convince him that they actually did telegram his wife when really they did not. And of course they muzzled the press. During Tsarist times, there would be news reports when prisoners did mass hunger strikes, no more. Soviet prisons, when their prisoners did hunger strikes, often tried force feeding. Quote, "Artificial feeding has much in common with rape, and that's what it really is. 4 big men force themselves on one weak being and deprive it of its one interdiction. They only need to do it once, and what happens next is not important." End quote. Most often they used a feeding tube forced down someone's throat, and they would pour liquid food down a funnel. They would then rub the stomach until they're sure the food is digested enough that they could not throw it back up. Sometimes also they would try to do that rectally. You can imagine that was not a fun time. Quote, hunger strikes are a continuation of counter-revolutionary activity in prison and must be punished with the new prison term, end quote. The political narrative was shifting. Hunger strikes are starting to be viewed as a kulak weapon, not as a way for prisoners to protest for their rights. In 1937, there was a new decree, quote, from now on, the prison administration will not be responsible in any way for those dying on hunger strikes, end quote. In fact, they went further. For every day that a prisoner under interrogation goes on a hunger strike, that time would be removed from the official tally of the time spent under interrogation, meaning that the hunger strike actually gave the interrogator more time, more breathing room, made it easier for that interrogator to meet their quota. Quote, let the only result of a hunger strike be the prisoner's exhaustion, end quote. Quote, even a strong man had no way left to fight the prison machine except perhaps suicide, but is suicide really resistance? Isn't it really submission? End quote. Among European nations, the Soviet machine was apparently uniquely good at crushing hunger strikes. One big reason for this was the stranglehold they had on the media. In the 1930s Soviet Union, prison policy, the way prisoners were treated, was sort of a hodgepodge. The conditions depended on which prison you were at, and often, even within the same prison, the conditions would vary depending on which group of people you're looking at. As far as political prisoners, there were all different flavors of them. There were mainstream communists who still tried to toe the party line. There were socialists who were different from communists. Christians, Tolstoyans, social democrats, Trotskyites, anarchists, and they all hated each other. Quote, in a Tsarist prison, the different parties often joined forces in a common struggle. In a Soviet prison, each political group tried to ensure its own purity by steering clear of the others, end quote. It often happened that for years after the other prisoners still had their rights, the mainstream communists would be restricted in their ability to communicate and their outside time, because if they tried to protest prison treatment, they would be called hypocrites for going against the party. Quote, the difference between the treatment of socialist prisoners and that of the communist extended many years, end quote. Solzhenitsyn gives an example from one communist prisoner he talked to, who recalls that the communists had to line up quietly for their outside time. Meanwhile, the socialists, who they could still see right over there, they were allowed to talk loudly and freely amongst themselves, so it was really a stark difference between those two groups. The Soviet Union also started building special-purpose prisons. That is where the name of this chapter, Churzak, comes in. These prisons were where they put well-known foreigners, famous people who could not be seen in the normal political camps. They also put prison rebels in there, as well as invalids, people injured, people too weak to make it in a normal prison. The living conditions in prisons had gone on a gradual decline, and by the late 30s it was very noticeable compared to the 20s. In the 1920s, prison food was good. Between the years 31 and 33, good food was harder to come by, even in freedom, especially in prison, though. But you can imagine even after conditions improved in freedom, the prison food didn't get much better. Many prisons were former monasteries, quote, self-incarceration in a monastery and incarceration in a prison by the state serve physically similar purposes, and therefore the buildings were always easy to adapt, end quote. And you probably remember how Krylenko, Stalin, and Lenin felt about Christianity. Those monasteries weren't being put to much use anyway. Depending on which prison you're at, you could expect between 15 and 45 minutes a day of outside time. Compare that to the start of the chapter, what the prisoners protested over. Quote, they even forbade lifting up one's head to the heavens during the walks, end quote. Look at your feet. Quote, light was always rationed in a cell, so to speak. The muzzles on the windows and the frosted reinforced glass created a permanent darkness in the cell. Darkness is an important factor in causing depression. They often stretched netting above the window muzzle, and in the winter it was covered in snow, which cut off this last access to the light. Reading became no more than a way of ruining one's eyes, end quote. Bars, muzzles, reinforced glass on the windows. Visiting privileges were gone in 1937. They were restricted to 2 letters a month. At one particular prison Solzhenitsyn knows of, prisoners were allowed to write letters twice a year and only on certain days. So, if for some reason you couldn't make it to the writing, when the prison administration declared, hey, you're allowed to write today, then you just don't get to write. But even if you did, they handed you a comically small piece of paper. As you may remember from previous chapters, this no communication between cells rule was taken pretty seriously. Making too much noise with your shoes on the ground, punishment cell. Coughing too loudly, well, that might be a signal, punishment cell. Walking around too much, well, that might be rebellious, punishment cell. They had random strip searches of prisoners as well. Solzhenitsyn gives one example of a punishment cell. It was completely dark, a cold room, the prisoner was completely naked, and there was a layer of water on the floor. The prisoner had to learn to sleep while sitting in a stool, otherwise he would be sleeping in water. He was supposed to be kept in there for 5 days. He was able to tell day from night by a tiny bead of light through a crack in the door, listened as hard as he could to hear the voices outside. When 5 days were up, he understood that his time was up. However, he also understood that the guards would have liked him to tell them that his time was up and asked to be let out. That would have been unruliness and would have gotten him more punishment. They were testing prisoner submissiveness that way. They often kept political prisoners in a cell, just 2 people, and the other person was a lunatic, for extended periods of time. Quote, "And only here is where our chapter ought to have begun. It ought to have examined that glimmering light which, in time, the soul of a lonely prisoner begins to emit, like the halo of a saint, torn from the hustle and bustle of life to such a degree that even counting the passing minutes puts him in touch with the universe." End quote. Quote, "The lonely prisoner has to have been purged from every imperfection of everything that has stirred and troubled him in his former life, that has prevented his muddy waters from settling into transparency." End quote. Towards the end of this chapter, Solzhenitsyn waxes extremely philosophical, begins to broach the topic of what prison does to the soul, hints at more. Quote, "How gratefully his fingers reach out to feel and crumble the lumps of earth in the vegetable garden, but alas, it is all asphalt. How his head rises of itself to the eternal heavens, but alas, that is forbidden. And how much touching attention the little bird on the window still arouses in him, but alas, there is that muzzle there, and the netting as well." End quote. Prisoners are not even allowed to write. Well, technically they are, but they need to buy their own paper from the commissary, and after they're done writing in it, they need to hand it over to the prison authorities. They're granted 1 book every 10 days, it gets changed out. They have no control over which book they get. How is a person meant to make it through that? Quote, "And so now we should begin the chapter on the conflict between the soul and the bars." End quote. But Solzhenitsyn leaves us on a cliffhanger and promises to get to that more in Book 4. And oh, does he, but we have 2 books to make it through before then.